Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey. Not across oceans or into the void of space, but deep, deep into time, to a world that is both ours and yet utterly alien. We're going to meet the humans who lived before us. Imagine, we are standing on the dusty shores of a vast, shimmering lake. This is not a place you would recognize from any map. Before you lies the ancient lake Turkana, 2 million years in the past. The sun feels hotter, more direct, and the sky is a shade of blue you've never quite seen before, vast and empty of jet trails. In the distance, the silhouettes of slumbering volcanoes smudge the horizon. The air doesn't smell of exhaust fumes or cut grass. It smells of dust, volcanic minerals, and the damp, earthy scent of unfamiliar vegetation. Giant, prehistoric elephants with downward-curving tusks wade in the shallows, and the cry of a bird you've never heard before echoes across the water. This is the cradle of our kind, and you are standing in the nursery. But in this immense, wild landscape, a movement catches your eye. Down by the water's edge, a small group is foraging among the reeds. From a distance, their shape is uncannily familiar. They walk on 2 legs, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon glare. They are a family, but as your focus sharpens, you see the differences. Their leader, a male, glances up, and his face is not like yours. He has a low, sloping forehead, a heavy ridge of bone over his eyes, and a jaw that juts forward without a chin. His arms, you notice, are just a little too long, his legs a little too short. He is not an ape, but he is not quite a modern human either. He is something else, a member of a forgotten branch of our own family tree. These are the beings who laid the groundwork for everything that was to come. Over the next 2 million years, their descendants will embark on one of the most incredible journeys in the planet's history. They will learn to see a tool hidden inside a stone, striking flakes from a core to create the world's first technology. They will confront their terror of the dark and the things that hunt within it, eventually taming fire and gathering around its protective glow. They will walk out of this African cradle, driven by curiosity and climate, spreading across the vast continents of Asia and Europe. Their bodies and minds will change, adapting to new challenges. New kinds of humans will arise, the master hunters of Ice Age Europe, perfectly built for the cold, the mysterious ghost lineages of Asia, known to us only by a finger bone and a strand of DNA, and the tiny fairy tale people who lived on a remote island, hunting dwarf elephants. So, who were all these other people, these other equally valid ways of being human? Why, after millions of years of flourishing diversity, are we the only ones left to ask the question? And what does their long epic story, and their ultimate silent disappearance, truly tell us about what it means to be human ourselves? Thanks to the painstaking work of paleontologists, digging for generations in the dust of forgotten landscapes, we can now begin to piece together their lost world. And tonight, we're going to walk through it together. Frankly, if you were dropped here without a time machine, you'd probably end up as a light snack for a saber-toothed cat before you even figured out where north was. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That small click sends a big signal to the algorithm. That long-form, serious educational content still matters. And to me, it's an incredibly meaningful show of support. Thank you so much for helping keep this channel going strong. It always fascinates me to see where you're all tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we can understand the players, you need to understand the stage. Our story doesn't begin with a person, or even a pre-person. It begins with the Earth itself. Long before the first hominin took its first upright step, the planet was setting the scene. Continents drifted at the speed your fingernails grow, crashing into each other in slow, silent collisions that buckled the crust and thrust mountains towards the sky. The world was warmer, then colder. Ice sheets advanced and retreated from the poles, locking up vast amounts of ocean water and changing weather patterns across the globe. It is a story of unimaginable timescales, of geological forces so immense they are almost impossible to truly comprehend. And in one particular corner of the world, these forces conspired to create a perfect laboratory for evolution. A place that would become the engine of our own creation, a crucible that would forge the first humans from the clay of their ape-like ancestors. This place is in Africa, a massive scar torn into the continent's surface, a land of fire and upheaval. It is where our journey truly begins. This scar, stretching for thousands of miles from the Middle East down to Mozambique, is the Great Rift Valley. It is, for all intents and purposes, a continent tearing itself apart in geological slow motion. For millions of years, titanic forces deep within the Earth's mantle have been pushing the Somali tectonic plate away from the rest of Africa, stretching the crust above it like warm taffy. In places, the crust thinned, cracked, and dropped down in colossal blocks, creating a valley floor thousands of feet below the surrounding highlands. This violent process pushed magma to the surface, birthing great volcanoes that spewed ash and lava, building mountains like Kilimanjaro from the flat plains. You are walking through a geological construction site, a work in progress for the last 30 million years. But this violent geology is precisely what made the valley the perfect engine for evolution. It wasn't one single uniform environment. The towering walls of the rift created dramatic rain shadows, meaning one side of a mountain could be lush and forested, while the other was arid scrubland. The valley floor became a basin for a chain of long, narrow lakes, fed by rivers that carved their way down from the highlands. The result was a compressed, incredibly diverse mosaic of habitats. Within a single day's walk, a creature could move from a dense, humid forest through an open woodland with scattered trees, out onto a vast, sun-scorched savannah, and then down into a swampy marshland by a lake's edge. This environmental patchwork was the key. It was a place of constant change and endless opportunity. It meant that if one environment became hostile, another was just over the hill. It created countless little pockets and niches where small, isolated populations of animals could be tested, shaped, and transformed by the unique pressures of their immediate surroundings. This is also why the valley is a paleoanthropologist's dream. It's one thing for an animal to live and die. It's another thing entirely for its bones to survive for millions of years. For that, you need special conditions, and the Rift Valley had them in spades. The numerous lakes and rivers provided the perfect setting for preservation. An animal that died near the water might be quickly covered by silt and mud, protecting its skeleton from scavengers and the elements. Then came the volcanoes, the second crucial ingredient. Every so often, one of the great peaks would erupt, blanketing the entire landscape in a thick layer of fine gray ash. This ash is a gift to science. It contains radioactive elements, specifically an isotope called potassium-40. Over immense spans of time, this unstable potassium decays into argon-40 gas at a perfectly steady, predictable rate. It is a geological clock. By measuring the ratio of potassium to argon in a layer of volcanic ash, scientists can determine, with astonishing accuracy, exactly when that ash fell. So, if you find a fossil skeleton lying just beneath a layer of volcanic tuff dated to 3.2 million years ago, you know your fossil is at least that old. This is the scientific evidence that underpins our entire story. The Rift Valley is a layer cake of time, with the fossils of our ancestors tucked between the dated pages. And what a world those pages reveal. As you walk this ancient landscape, the wildlife is a strange mix of the familiar and the fantastical. You see herds of zebra and antelope, but they are hunted by predators you've only seen in museums. A saber-toothed cat, Dinophalis, stalks through the tall grass, its oversized canines hidden behind snarling lips. You steer clear of the riverbanks, wary of crocodiles, but also of something that looks like an elephant, yet isn't. This is a Deinotherium, a colossal beast with strange, downward-curving tusks sprouting from its lower jaw, which it may have used to strip bark from trees. Troops of giant baboons, some as large as a male gorilla, forage noisily in the woodlands, far more formidable than their modern cousins. The air is alive with the sounds of this lost world, a world where our ancestors were not the masters, but just one of the many creatures trying to make it to the next sunrise. One of the most famous slices of this layer cake is a place in Tanzania now called Oldowan Gorge. It's a smaller canyon that cuts into the plains, revealing almost 2 million years of geological and human history. Sometimes called the Grand Canyon of Prehistory, it was, incredibly, brought to the world's attention by accident. In 1911, a German entomologist named Wilhelm Kattwinkel was in the area collecting butterflies. Lost in his pursuit, he nearly stumbled and fell off the gorge's cliff edge, and in doing so, he noticed the fossil bones eroding from its steep sides. It was a serendipitous moment that would change the course of paleontology. Yet even with this perfect stage, historians still argue whether the dynamic, shifting environment of the Rift Valley was the primary catalyst for hominin evolution. Was it this unique geological setting that forced our ancestors onto 2 feet and spurred their growing intelligence? Or were other, bigger forces at play, like global climate shifts that affected the entire planet, with the Rift Valley simply being the place we are lucky enough to find the evidence? The debate continues, but what is certain is that it was here, in this beautiful, violent, and ever-changing landscape, that the first characters in our human story took their first steps. And so, on this stage of volcanic fire and shifting landscapes, our first protagonists appear. They are not yet of the genus Homo. They are your deep ancestors, the hominins who came right before us, a diverse and successful group known as the Australopithecines. The name, coined from Latin and Greek, simply means southern apes, and for a long time, that's how they were seen, as a slightly unusual kind of ape. They were small-brained, with faces that jutted forward and long, powerful arms. In many ways, they were still tied to a life in the trees. But they possessed one revolutionary, game-changing trait that set them on a completely new evolutionary path. A trait that, for the first time, marked a clear divergence from the lineage that would lead to modern chimpanzees. They walked on 2 feet. For decades, the evidence for these creatures was frustratingly scant. A fragment of a skull here, a tooth there. They were like ghosts in the fossil record. impossible to see clearly. That all changed on a hot November morning in 1974. A young American paleoanthropologist named Donald Johanson was surveying a dry, sun-baked gully in a region of Ethiopia called Hadar. As he scanned the ground, something caught his eye. It was not a tooth or a jaw, but a piece of an arm bone. Then another piece, and another. His team began a meticulous excavation, and over the next few weeks, they unearthed a paleontological treasure. A single skeleton, 40% complete, of a female Australopithecine who had lived and died there 3.2 million years ago. Back in camp that night, a tape recorder was playing the Beatles' song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" over and over again. The name stuck. Lucy, she was called, was a revelation. She was the first fossil hominin complete enough to give us a true, holistic picture of what these beings were actually like. Looking at her remains, you can see a creature of two worlds. She was tiny, standing only about 3.5 feet tall and weighing perhaps 60 pounds. Her upper body was still very ape-like. Her long arms and the powerful muscle attachments on her shoulders, combined with fingers that were long and curved, tell you that she was a skilled and frequent climber. For her, the trees were still a vital resource, a place to find food and, most importantly, a safe place to sleep, far from the reach of nocturnal predators. But it's when you look at her lower body that you see the future taking shape. Her pelvis was not the long, narrow blade of a chimpanzee, which is adapted for climbing and walking on all fours. It was short and bowl-shaped, remarkably similar to your own. This shape is crucial. It provides support for the upper body and reorients the gluteal muscles for stable, upright walking. Her thigh bones, the femurs, didn't run straight down from her hips. They angled inwards, coming together at the knees. This is called a valgus angle, and it allows the feet to land more directly under the body's center of gravity with each stride, preventing you from waddling side to side. Lucy was built to walk. This was a groundbreaking anatomical argument, but the final indisputable proof came 4 years later in what is now Tanzania. A team led by the legendary Mary Leakey was exploring a site called Laetoli. There, preserved in a layer of ancient volcanic ash, they found something breathtaking. It was a set of fossilized footprints left by 2, possibly 3 hominins who had walked across a muddy plain of fresh ash some 3.6 million years ago. You can see their path, stride for stride, frozen in stone. The tracks are astonishingly human. They show a clear heel strike, followed by the foot rolling forward and pushing off with the big toe. Crucially, that big toe is in line with the rest of the foot, not splayed out to the side like an ape's grasping toe. This was the smoking gun. This was undeniable scientific proof that hominins like Lucy were walking upright, with a modern, efficient gait, millions of years before our own genus, Homo, even existed. This adaptation, bipedalism, is now considered the foundational fact of the human lineage. It was the first domino to fall. Why it happened is still debated. Perhaps it was to see over tall grass, to regulate body temperature, or most likely, to free the hands. Hands no longer needed for knuckle walking could now be used for other things, to carry food back to the group, to carry vulnerable infants, and eventually to carry the first stone tools. Imagine Lucy and her family. They live in a small, close-knit social group, spending their days moving through the mosaic of woodland and savanna, foraging for fruits, nuts, seeds, insects, and perhaps scavenging the occasional piece of meat. They are constantly aware, constantly vigilant. they are prey. Life is a delicate balance between finding enough food on the ground and staying close enough to the safety of the trees. They are pioneers, exploring a new way of life on the ground, powered by a strange new form of locomotion that would, in time, change the world. For 1,000,000 years, Lucy's kind and their relatives thrived in that world, successfully navigating the balance between the trees and the ground. But the world itself does not stand still. The stage you've been watching was on the verge of a profound and permanent transformation. Around 3 million years ago, the planet's thermostat began to drop. A long, slow cooling trend set in, driven by subtle shifts in the Earth's orbit and tilt. At the poles, vast ice caps began to grow, locking up immense quantities of the world's water in continent-sized sheets of ice. This had a dramatic cascading effect on global climate. With less water available to evaporate from the oceans, the atmosphere grew drier. The reliable monsoon-like rains that had nourished Africa's great forests began to fail. The consequence was stark and simple. The forests began to die back. Year by year, century by century, the tree canopy retreated, and in its place, a new landscape began to conquer the continent. The open, sun-drenched grasslands of the Savannah. This dramatic environmental shift gave rise to one of the most powerful and elegant theories in human evolution, the Savannah hypothesis. The argument is beautifully straightforward. As the forests shrank, the old lifestyle of the Australopithecines, with one foot on the ground and one in the canopy, became increasingly difficult. The safety of the trees was now farther away, the patches of woodland more scattered. The environment had changed the rules of the game. This new world, the Savannah, presented a completely different set of challenges and opportunities. It favored creatures who could travel efficiently over long distances, walking on 2 legs between widely dispersed sources of food and water. It favored cooperation, as more eyes were needed to spot predators in the tall grass. And it offered a tantalizing new item on the menu: the vast herds of grazing animals. A mobile, calorie-rich food source for any creature that could figure out how to acquire it. In this view, the Savannah was the catalyst. It was the environmental pressure that selected for the very traits that would come to define our genus: endurance, intelligence, and a taste for meat. You must imagine this period not as a gentle, gradual transition, but as a time of immense evolutionary pressure. It was a crucible. For the many different species of hominins and other primates living at the time, this was an existential test. Those lineages that were too specialized, too dependent on the fruits and safety of the dense forest, simply vanished. Their branch of the great evolutionary bush withered and died out. But for every extinction, a new opportunity is born. The challenges of life on the Savannah created a new adaptive landscape, a new set of problems waiting for a new kind of mind to solve them. This ecological pressure cooker was forcing a choice: adapt, migrate, or perish. And it was out of this intense, unforgiving filter that a new kind of hominin was about to emerge, one with a slightly bigger brain and a revolutionary new idea about what you could do with a stone. We know this dramatic shift from forest to grassland happened thanks to some incredibly clever science. Researchers drilled deep into the floor of the ocean, off the coast of Africa, extracting long, cylindrical cores of sediment that have been accumulating, layer by microscopic layer, for millions of years. These cores are time capsules. Within them, scientists can analyze 2 key things. First, they find ancient pollen grains, blown from the continent out to sea. Under a microscope, you can tell the difference between pollen from forest trees and pollen from savanna grasses. By counting the ratios, they can reconstruct what the vegetation was like at any given time. Second, they analyze the dust itself. The chemical signature of the dust tells them how arid the continent was. The scientific evidence from these deep-sea cores is unambiguous. It shows a clear, major shift from a wet, forested Africa to a cooler, drier, grassier Africa, right around the time our story takes a crucial turn. Of course, the reality was a little more complex than just a flat, endless sea of grass. This ancient savannahscape was a mosaic. There were vast open plains, yes, but they were crisscrossed by rivers. And along these riverbanks, dense gallery forests would have persisted. There were also large lakes and wetlands, oases of life in the dry landscape. This quirky tidbit is crucial because it means our ancestors didn't have to abandon the safety of trees all at once. They could still use these pockets of woodland as a home base. And this complexity has led to a more nuanced scientific debate. Today, many scientists still argue about the exact impact of the classic savanna hypothesis. An increasing number now favor what's called the variability selection model. This idea suggests that the primary driver wasn't the shift to savanna itself, but the increasing instability of the climate. The world began to fluctuate wildly between very wet and very dry periods. This chaotic environment would have favored not specialists, but ultimate generalists. Creatures with bigger, more flexible brains who could adapt their behavior on the fly, switching between different food sources and strategies as the world changed, sometimes rapidly, around them. The pressure wasn't to be a savanna dweller, but to be a problem solver. And a new species of problem solver was about to take the stage. In the harsh, sun-bleached landscape of Oldowan Gorge in Tanzania, two figures became fixtures of the landscape themselves. For over 30 years, starting in the 1930s, Louis and Mary Leakey dedicated their lives to combing the gorge's dusty slopes. They were a force of nature, a paleoanthropological dynasty driven by an unshakable belief that the deepest secrets of human origins were buried right there, in that specific slice of the Great Rift Valley. They endured scorching heat, dust storms, and decades of frustratingly fragmentary finds, all in the pursuit of a single goal: to find the maker of the simple stone tools they were unearthing by the thousands. They knew someone had been there, chipping away at river cobbles nearly 2 million years ago. But who? For years, the toolmaker remained a ghost. Then, in the early 1960s, their persistence paid off. Their son, Jonathan, discovered the fossilized remains of a new type of hominin. It was different from the robust Australopithecines they had previously found. The team unearthed a partial skull with a noticeably larger, more rounded brain case. They found a lower jaw with smaller, more delicate molars than any Australopithecine. And, most tellingly, they found a collection of hand bones. These bones suggested a creature capable of a precision grip, the kind of grip you need to hold a hammerstone in one hand and a core in the other, striking them together with purpose and skill. The Leakeys looked at the evidence before them. A creature with a bigger brain, more human-like teeth, and dexterous hands, found in the very same geological layers as the mysterious stone tools. They put 2 and 2 together. Their conclusion was a scientific bombshell. This, they argued, was the toolmaker. This was the direct ancestor of humanity. And because of this intimate connection to technology, they gave it a new and evocative name: Homo habilis, a Latin phrase meaning handyman. You cannot overstate what a radical and controversial act this was. At the time, The genus Homo was a very exclusive club, reserved for beings like the large-brained Neanderthals and ourselves. To include this small 2-million-year-old creature was to fundamentally redefine what it meant to be human. It pushed the origin of our own lineage back by more than 1 million years and placed this much more primitive-looking being at the very foundation of our family tree. They were arguing that the invention of technology itself was the birth certificate of humanity. So, let's paint a portrait of this new face on the scene. If you were to meet Homo habilis, you would be struck by its transitional nature. Its head housed a brain of around 600 cubic centimeters. This is a significant leap, a full 30% larger than the average Australopithecine brain, but it's still less than half the size of your own. Its face was less projecting than Lucy's, its jaw less massive. The smaller back teeth, the molars, suggest a change in diet, a move away from the tough, fibrous plants that required endless grinding. Perhaps they were eating more meat, or perhaps they were using their new tools to pound and process their food before eating it, letting technology do some of the work their jaws used to do. But from the neck down, the picture is more primitive. Homo habilis still possessed long arms, with proportions quite similar to the earlier Australopithecines. This tells you quite clearly that climbing was still a very important part of its life. Like Lucy, it likely sought refuge in the trees at night. It was a creature still very much connected to the world of its ancestors. According to the mainstream historical consensus, Homo habilis lived from approximately 2.4 million years ago down to 1.4 million years ago. And it's crucial to remember, this was not a lonely existence. For much of its time on Earth, it shared the African landscape with other hominins, later species of Australopithecines, and, eventually, the early members of the next human on the scene, Homo erectus. It was a busy and competitive world. Ultimately, Homo habilis is best understood as a tweener species, a perfect mosaic of old and new. It represents a critical bridge in our story. It had one foot still firmly planted in the world of the Australopithecines, small-bodied, a proficient climber, and still very much prey. But its other foot was stepping decisively into a new reality, one defined by an expanding brain and the transformative power of technology. It was not yet the master of its world, but it was learning how to shape it, one sharp stone flake at a time. That single sharp stone flake is the key to understanding the world of Homo habilis. When you hear the phrase stone tool, your mind might conjure up images of elaborate arrowheads or mighty stone axes. You need to erase those images completely. The first technology, the toolkit associated with handyman, was far simpler, more practical, and in many ways more profound. Archaeologists call it the Oldowan industry, named, of course, for Oldowan Gorge, where these tools were first found by the thousands. These were not weapons for mighty hunters. You wouldn't use one to bring down a prehistoric elephant. They were, in essence, a portable butcher's kit, a set of implements for processing carcasses and plants. They were the tools of a clever scavenger and an opportunistic forager. Imagine you are standing by a dry riverbed, the primary hardware store for an early hominin. You can recreate this entire toolkit with 3 simple concepts. First, you find a hard, dense stone that fits comfortably in your palm. This is your hammerstone. Its job is simply to be heavy and durable. Second, you find another, slightly softer stone, perhaps a piece of volcanic lava or flint. This is your core. Now the magic happens. Holding the core in one hand, you strike its edge at a precise angle with your hammerstone. If you do it right, a piece of stone flies off. The piece remaining in your hand, the core, now has a fresh, sharp, jagged edge. This is what we often call a chopper, and it's useful for heavy-duty tasks like smashing open a bone to get at the rich marrow inside. But the real prize, the most important piece of this technological puzzle, is the third item, the piece that flew off. This is the flake. It might look like just a waste product, a piece of debris. But this thin, razor-sharp flake was the Stone Age scalpel. Its edge is sharper than a steel knife, capable of slicing through the thick hide of an antelope or severing a tendon with ease. For a small hominin trying to carve a meal from a carcass left behind by a lion, speed was everything. These portable, disposable, razor-sharp flakes were the key to survival, allowing them to process their food and get away before larger, more dangerous scavengers arrived on the scene. We know what these simple stones were used for, thanks to a fascinating field of science called use-ware analysis. You can take a 2-million-year-old stone flake, place it under a powerful scanning electron microscope, and the story of its use is written on its edge. Microscopic scratches, chips, and polishes create a unique signature. The sheen left by slicing through animal flesh is different from the polish created by scraping a piece of wood. The tiny striations from cutting soft plant stems are different from the abrasive wear of scraping hide. This scientific evidence allows us to say with confidence that these tools were used for a whole range of activities. Butchering animals, cutting plants, and working wood, perhaps to sharpen a stick for digging. But the true significance of the Oldowan tool is not what it did, but what it represents in the mind of its maker. This was not just an animal using an object, like a chimpanzee using a stick to get termites. This was manufacturing. To create even the simplest Oldowan flake requires a whole sequence of advanced cognitive abilities. First, you need foresight, the ability to plan for a future need. You're not hungry right now, but you know you will be, so you make a tool in preparation. Second, you need a knowledge of materials. You have to know that this kind of rock will fracture predictably, while that kind of rock will just crumble into dust. Third, you need abstract thought. You have to be able to look at a dull, rounded cobble and visualize the sharp edge hidden within it. And finally, you need the complex motor skills and hand-eye coordination to strike the core at the perfect angle with the perfect amount of force to release that hidden edge. This is the beginning of a fundamentally new way of thinking, imposing a preconceived idea from the mind onto the raw material of the physical world. For a long time, archaeologists would find large collections of these tools together with piles of animal bones, and they would label these sites as home bases, imagining our ancestors sitting around a campfire, sharing food. There's a continuing scholarly debate about this, with the consensus shifting to a more cautious interpretation. Archaeologists now argue whether these sites were truly homes, or simply convenient butchering sites. The more likely scenario is that they were kill sites of large predators, which Habilis would cautiously approach to quickly scavenge what was left. What we are seeing in the record isn't a cozy campsite, but the messy leavings of a quick, frantic, and dangerous meal. And here is a truly quirky tidbit to put it all in perspective. This simple toolkit, the hammerstone, core, and flake, remained the dominant technology on the planet for over 1 million years, barely changing in its design. It is, without a doubt, the longest-lasting, most successful technological tradition in the history of our planet. A simple idea that worked, and worked for an unimaginably long time. That incredibly long-lasting and successful toolkit presented a profound problem for its discoverers. Once Louis and Mary Leakey had the bones of the toolmaker, they faced a monumental choice, one that would echo through the halls of paleoanthropology for the next 60 years. Where did this creature belong in the grand scheme of our family tree? Was this handy man, with its bigger brain and clever hands, simply a very advanced species of Australopithecine? Or was it something more? Was this the first faint dawn of our own kind, the earliest known member of the genus Homo? This wasn't just a dry academic debate about Latin names. This was about drawing a line in the 2-million-year-old dust. It was an attempt to define the very moment our ancestors ceased to be just bipedal apes and began the journey to becoming truly human. To make their case, the Leakeys, along with their esteemed colleagues Philip Tobias and John Napier, built their argument on 3 foundational pillars, a set of criteria that they believed lifted Homo habilis out of the world of the Australopithecines and into our exclusive club. The first pillar was its posture. Based on the leg and foot bones they had found, they knew Habilis walked fully upright on 2 legs. While they also knew Australopithecines were bipedal, this upright stance was still considered a non-negotiable prerequisite for entry into the human family. It was the physical foundation upon which everything else was built. The second pillar was its manual dexterity. The hand bones discovered at Oldowan were a revelation. They were more robust than a modern human's, but they showed a clear shift away from the hands of an ape. The fingers were straighter, the palm was broader, and the thumb was longer and more mobile. It was a hand that was losing its adaptations for climbing and gaining new power for manipulation. They argued it was clearly capable of what we call a precision grip, the ability to delicately and firmly pinch an object between the thumb and fingertips. This grip is the key to both the fine motor control needed to make a stone tool and the strength needed to use it effectively. But the third pillar was the true clincher, the evidence that, for them, was undeniable. It was the tool culture itself. The sheer number of Oldowan tools, the consistency of their design over vast stretches of time, and their direct, indisputable association with the Habilis fossils was the smoking gun. An ape might pick up a stick or a rock to use as a tool, they argued, but it doesn't systematically manufacture thousands of them to a set pattern. That requires culture, the transmission of knowledge and skill from one generation to the next. This, they claimed, was the behavior of a human, not an animal. Louis Leakey famously argued that this combination of a significantly larger brain and a sustained tool-making culture represented a cerebral Rubicon. The phrase is a powerful historical allusion. When Julius Caesar led his army across the Rubicon River, it was an irrevocable act that plunged the Roman Republic into civil war. There was no turning back. For Leakey, the invention of a tool culture was humanity's Rubicon. It was the point of no return, an evolutionary leap so profound that the lineage that made it was forever separated from its more primitive past. Once our ancestors began to shape the world to their will, they had crossed into a new cognitive and behavioral reality. They had crossed into the genus Homo. You can see the appeal of this argument. It created a beautifully neat and linear picture of our past, a satisfying story of progress. First, you have the Australopithecines, like Lucy, our ape-like ancestors who had mastered walking but not much else. Then, in a heroic leap of innovation, Homo habilis arrives on the scene, the clever handyman, who invents technology and thereby launches the human experiment. It's a simple, elegant narrative. The formal definition of our genus has, in fact, always been a bit fuzzy and contentious, as a mainstream historical fact. But the discovery of Habilis forced the issue, stretching that definition to include a much older, much more primitive-looking member based on this new behavioral criterion. For a time, the story seemed settled. But this neat picture, this tidy house built on 3 strong pillars, was standing on shaky ground, and a series of new discoveries, new earthquakes in the world of paleontology, were about to shake it to its very foundations, challenging every single one of those assumptions and turning our simple family line into a gloriously complicated puzzle. The first tremor to shake the foundations of that neat 3-pillared house came just a decade after Homo habilis was officially named. The discovery of Lucy in 1974 was the initial shock. As you'll remember, her skeleton, particularly her human-like pelvis and the angle of her thigh bone, provided a powerful anatomical argument that Australopithecines were accomplished walkers. Then, just a few years later in 1978, the second, more powerful shockwave hit with the discovery of the Laetoli footprints. Those tracks, pressed into volcanic ash 3.6 million years ago, were the final, undeniable proof. Here was a snapshot in time, a moment frozen in stone, showing 2 of Lucy's kind walking with a stride nearly identical to your own. Suddenly, the first pillar of the argument for Homo habilis, its upright posture, crumbled into dust. Bipedalism wasn't a special innovation of the genus Homo. It wasn't a new development that heralded the dawn of humanity. It was an ancient, foundational trait of the entire hominin lineage, a behavior that had been perfected for well over 1 million years before the first habilis ever walked the earth. Walking on 2 legs was simply the entry ticket to being a hominin. It couldn't be used to grant special access to the exclusive club of Homo. The first criterion was null and void. For decades, however, the other 2 pillars, the dexterous hands and the tool culture they created, seemed to hold firm. Habilis may not have been the first to walk, the thinking went, but it was certainly the first to think like a toolmaker. This was its unique contribution, its cerebral Rubicon. Then, in 2015, a discovery was announced from a site in Kenya called Lomekwi 3. And this time, the earthquake didn't just shake the house, it leveled it completely. Archaeologists had found a collection of stone tools that were different from the Oldowan. They were larger, cruder, and made with a simpler technique, almost as if the maker was using a boulder as both a hammer and an anvil. But the truly revolutionary thing about them was their age. They were dated to an astonishing 3.3 million years old. Let that number sink in for a moment. 3.3 million years. That is 3/4 million years older than the very first appearance of Homo habilis in the fossil record. The implications were staggering and undeniable. The title of handyman had to be stripped from habilis. It was not the first tool maker. The invention of technology, that supposed Rubicon of human consciousness, had been crossed by someone else, someone much more ancient. The most likely candidate is an Australopithecine, perhaps Lucy's species, or another contemporary. The inventor of technology was not a Homo, but an ape man. This mind-bending discovery was supported by scientific evidence that had been found a few years earlier. At a site in Dikika, Ethiopia, the same site where the fossil skeleton of a 3-year-old Australopithecine child was found, researchers discovered a pair of large animal bones, a rib and a femur. These bones were dated to 3.4 million years ago. What was so special about them was their surface. Under high magnification, you could see a series of fine, parallel lines and deeper V-shaped gouges. these were the unmistakable microscopic signatures of stone tools being used to cut meat from a bone and smash it open for marrow. While no tools were found at that specific spot, the marks on the bones were a fossil of a behavior, a clear sign that some hominin was butchering its food with stone tools 1,000,000 years before Habilis. With all three of its defining pillars now lying in ruins, the classification of Homo habilis became one of the biggest problems in paleoanthropology. It wasn't uniquely bipedal. It wasn't the first to possess the dexterity for tool-making. And, most devastatingly, it wasn't the species that invented technology. The entire original justification for welcoming it into our genus had been erased by new evidence. So, the question became unavoidable. If handyman isn't special in any of the ways we thought it was, what on earth is it doing in the genus Homo? This has ignited a fierce, ongoing scholarly debate. Many prominent scientists argue that it's time to formally evict Habilis from our genus and reclassify it as Australopithecus habilis, a slightly brainier, tool-using southern ape. Others suggest it's so distinct from both groups that it needs its own new genus. For now, however, inertia reigns. Homo habilis remains in our genus, largely due to historical tradition and a general reluctance to rewrite every textbook, museum display, and scientific paper. It is, as many paleontologists now call it, a taxon in limbo, a species without a country, a ghost at the base of our family tree. With Homo habilis adrift, a species without a clear justification for its own famous name, paleoanthropologists found themselves in a difficult position. The original definition, based on the behavior of tool-making, had been completely dismantled. If you still wanted to keep habilis in our genus, you needed a new reason, a new line in the sand. And so, the focus shifted from what our ancestors did to what they were. If behavior was too messy, perhaps the answer lay in raw anatomy. Specifically, it lay inside the skull. The story of human evolution, after all, is fundamentally the story of an expanding, reorganizing brain. The new thinking was that a significant, measurable increase in cognitive horsepower, reflected in the sheer volume of the brain, could serve as a new, more objective Rubicon. This led to the creation of an informal, but for a time very influential, rule of thumb. A new cutoff was proposed. For a fossil hominin to be admitted into the genus Homo, it must have an adult brain size of at least 600 cubic centimeters. The number wasn't pulled out of thin air. It was a convenient benchmark. The largest known Australopithecine brains topped out just below that mark, and the first few Habilis fossils discovered hovered right around it. It seemed, for a moment, to be a clean, quantitative solution. It replaced the fuzzy, behavioral definition with a simple measurement you could get with a set of calipers and some basic math. The scientific evidence used to make these arguments comes from more than just measuring the volume of an empty skull. In rare cases, when a skull fills with fine sediment that later hardens into rock, it can create a natural endocast, a perfect impression of the inner surface of the cranium. This is essentially a fossil of the brain's shape. And from these endocasts, scientists can learn about a brain's organization, not just its size. They can see the patterns of veins and arteries that supplied it with blood, and they can see the relative proportions of the different lobes. They look for signs of a shift towards a more human-like brain structure, such as a swelling in a part of the frontal lobe called Broca's area. In you and me, this region is critically important for the production of language. Finding even a subtle expansion of this area in an ancient hominin is a tantalizing clue that its brain was reorganizing in a very human-like direction. This new brain-size-based definition seemed promising. It provided a clear, anatomical justification for keeping Habilis as the founder of our lineage. But then, as so often happens in this field, a new discovery came along that spoiled the simple picture. The fossil in question is a famous skull known by its museum catalogue's number, KNM-ER1813, found at Kubifora in Kenya. It's a beautiful, remarkably complete specimen of Homo habilis. But when researchers calculated its cranial capacity, the result was a shock. Its brain volume was only 510 cubic centimeters. This was a major problem. 510 cubic centimeters was not only drastically below the proposed 600 cubic centimeter cutoff, it was barely larger than the brain of a particularly robust Australopithecine. This one fossil threw the entire brain size rule into chaos. It raised a thorny question that continues to bedevil paleoanthropology to this day. How much physical variation can you expect within a single species that lived millions of years ago? Was the smaller-brained ER1813 just a small female, while the larger 650 cubic centimeter specimens were large males? Or were they two entirely different species that were being mistakenly lumped together? If you decided to keep the small-brained individual in Homo habilis, then your 600 cubic centimeter rule was meaningless. The new clean line in the sand had just been washed away. To give you a quirky but essential sense of scale, let's put these numbers in perspective. Your own brain is likely somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,350 cubic centimeters. A modern chimpanzee, our closest living relative, has a brain of about 400 cubic centimeters. Lucy and her Australopithecine cousins were a step up, averaging around 450 cubic centimeters. That new fossil, KNM-ER1813, at 510 cubic centimeters, is only slightly larger. Even the bigger habilis specimens, at 650 cubic centimeters, are still closer to their Australopithecine ancestors than they are to you. They sit squarely in the middle, a true anatomical intermediate. And it is this in-between status that makes them so fascinating and so infuriatingly difficult to classify. They are a living testament to the fact that evolution doesn't happen in neat, sudden leaps, but in a messy, gradual continuum that defies our attempts to draw simple lines. The problem of that messy continuum, of a species so variable that it defied our neat categories, was just the beginning. The evolutionary picture was about to get even more crowded. As you'll recall, the smaller Habilis skull, ER1813, was found near the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya. In 1972, just a few years later, and in that same fossil-rich region, a team led by Richard Leakey, the son of Louis and Mary, continuing the family legacy, made another landmark discovery. His team found a skull that had been shattered into hundreds of tiny fragments. Over months of painstaking, jigsaw-like reconstruction, they pieced together a cranium that would once again force a re-evaluation of our origins. Its name in the catalogue is KNM-ER1470. At first glance, this new individual seemed to solve the brain size problem. Its cranial capacity was immense for the time, a whopping 775 cubic centimeters. This was over 100 cubic centimeters larger than the biggest known Habilis skull, and a full 250 cubic centimeters larger than the small ER1813. It was a brain well on its way to becoming human. But as the rest of the skull came together, a strange new portrait emerged. The brain was big, but the face was bizarre. Unlike the relatively narrow projecting face of Homo habilis, this new skull had a face that was incredibly long, broad, and surprisingly flat. It had a strong brow ridge, but it was tucked beneath a more vertical forehead. And though the teeth themselves were missing, the large sockets left behind in the robust jaw suggested it had some serious dental hardware. Initially, researchers tried to fit this new find into the existing box. Given the ongoing debate about variation, the most convenient explanation was that this was simply a big male Homo habilis, and the smaller, more delicate skulls like ER1813 were the females. This phenomenon, where males and females of a species look very different, is called sexual dimorphism, and it's common in many primates. For a while, this interpretation held sway. It kept the family tree tidy, with just one founding species for our genus. But as more scientists studied the reconstruction, many began to feel that the differences were just too profound to be chalked up to sex. It wasn't just a matter of size. The entire blueprint of the face, the whole cranial architecture, was different. The face of 1470 wasn't just a scaled-up version of the Habilis face. It was built to a different plan. And so, in 1986, it was officially given its own species name, Homo Rudolfensis, named after the former name of the lake where it was found, Lake Rudolf. The human family had a new, mysterious member. This discovery shattered any remaining hope for a simple, linear story of our origins. Now you have two distinct species of early Homo, living in the same place at the same time, around 1.9 million years ago. This raises a critical question. Who is who in our family zoo? Was the small-brained, tool-making Habilis our direct ancestor? Or was it the large-brained, flat-faced Rudolfensis? Or perhaps were they both evolutionary cousins, sister species on two parallel tracks? And our true ancestor was a third, still undiscovered species? The neat line of descent had dissolved into a question mark. This has led to a fierce and ongoing scholarly debate that continues to this day. Paleoanthropologists are split. On one side, you have the splitters, who are convinced these are two separate species, each with its own unique adaptations. Some in this camp champion Rudolfensis as our true ancestor, arguing its large brain makes it the more likely candidate to lead to later, even bigger-brained humans. Others argue that Habilis, with its more delicate features, is a better fit. On the other side, you have the lumpers. They maintain that the differences are still within the plausible range of variation for a single, highly dimorphic species. To them, these are all just different faces of Homo habilis. But regardless of where you stand in this taxonomic argument, the ultimate takeaway is the same, and it is profound. The dawn of our genus was not a solitary event. The African landscape 2 million years ago was not occupied by a single, linear ancestor. It was a world populated by a diversity of human-like experiments. At least two, and possibly more, distinct hominin species were walking the shores of Lake Turkana, each finding a different way to survive, each a different answer to the question of how to be human. Our story does not begin with a single trunk, but with a dense and tangled thicket of branches. In that tangled thicket of early humanity, with several different kinds of hominins sharing the landscape, a fundamental question arises. How did they actually live? What was a day like for these small, clever creatures, poised between the world of apes and the world of humans? Let's imagine a small band, a family group of one of these early Homo species, as the first light of dawn spills over the savannah. They have spent the night huddled for safety in a dense thicket of acacia trees near a river. The air is cool, and the ground is damp with dew. As the sun begins to warm the earth, they stir. The day is governed by a simple, relentless imperative: the search for calories. Their growing brains are hungry, demanding constant fuel. The group moves out from the relative safety of the woodland, their eyes scanning the open grasslands that stretch before them. For a long time, we pictured this scene very differently. We were in love with the idea of man the hunter, a heroic narrative that depicted our ancestors as mighty, spear-wielding predators who rose to dominance by conquering the great beasts of their time. It's a romantic, powerful image, but the evidence tells a much more humble and, frankly, more interesting story. These early humans were not the top of the food chain. They were opportunistic, scrappy survivors, taking what they could get in a world filled with creatures much larger, faster, and stronger than they were. The modern consensus is that they were primarily scavengers and foragers, not hunters. Their survival depended on their wits. Imagine the group moving across the savannah, their eyes not on the herds of grazing antelope, but on the sky above them. They are looking for vultures. The sight of these birds circling and descending is the surest sign that there is a fresh carcass nearby, a kill made by a true predator like a lion or a saber-toothed cat. Then begins a tense and dangerous calculation. Is the predator still there? Is it safe to approach? They move in cautiously, a small, chattering group armed with nothing but their stone tools and their cooperative courage. Their goal is not to fight the lion, but to steal its leftovers. Once the predator has eaten its fill and moved off, they rush in. Time is of the essence. Using their sharp stone flakes, those Stone Age scalpels, they quickly slice off any remaining scraps of meat. But the real prize, the treasure they are uniquely equipped to get, is locked away inside the bones. Using their heavy choppers as hammers, they smash open the long leg bones of the dead animal to get at the fatty, calorie-dense marrow within. This was a food source unavailable to almost any other creature, a crucial reserve of brain-building nutrients. The scientific evidence for this scavenging lifestyle is written on the bones themselves. When paleoanthropologists examine fossilized animal bones from hominin sites under a microscope, they can sometimes see two different kinds of marks. There are the deep, U-shaped grooves left by the gnawing teeth of a large carnivore, and then there are the thin, sharp, V-shaped slice marks made by a hominin's stone tool. The crucial clue is the sequence. In many cases, the stone tool marks are found superimposed on top of the carnivore tooth marks. This is the smoking gun. It tells you who got there first. The lion made the kill and chewed on the bone. The hominins came in later and sliced off the remaining bits of flesh. They were second in line at the dinner table, and it was an incredibly dangerous table to be sitting at. You must understand that this was a world of terror, populated by a nightmare menagerie of predators. There was Megantherion, a powerful saber-toothed cat the size of a jaguar. There was the giant hyena, Pachycrocuta, a beast as large as a lioness with a bone-crushing bite that made modern hyenas look tame. And then there was Dinophalis, the terrible cat, a fearsome ambush predator. Our ancestors were firmly lodged in the middle of the food chain. They were predators of tortoises, lizards, and small game, but they were very much the prey of every large carnivore on the savannah. Their lives were a constant exercise in vigilance and risk assessment. Every trip to the waterhole, every scavenging attempt, was a life-or-death gamble. It's in this context that a quirky little tidbit about our own minds makes a lot of sense. While we've been talking about these giant, dramatic predators, the small, quiet dangers were just as lethal. A bite from a puff adder, a sting from a scorpion, the neurotoxin of a spider. For a small, barefoot hominin with no access to medicine, these were death sentences. Some evolutionary psychologists believe that our modern, seemingly irrational fears of snakes and spiders might be a deep-seated evolutionary hangover, a psychological fossil left over from millions of years of our ancestors having to scan every footstep and every handhold for these small, silent threats. For decades, the epicenter of our human origin story was firmly planted in the Great Rift Valley of East Africa. The discoveries from Oldowan, Lake Turkana, and Hadar had, for many, defined the main stage where the play of our evolution unfolded. But all the while, another part of the continent, hundreds of miles to the south, was holding its own secrets. In the rolling, rocky grasslands of South Africa lies a region so rich in hominin fossils that it's been named the cradle of humankind. And it was here, in 2008, that a discovery born of pure chance would introduce a new and perplexing character to our story. The paleoanthropologist Lee Berger had been searching the area for years. One afternoon, he was out exploring with his 9-year-old son, Matthew. As many 9-year-olds are prone to do, Matthew was chasing his dog, Tao, through the tall grass. He tripped and fell. When he looked up, he saw a piece of rock with something pale sticking out of it. He called out to his father, "Dad, I found a fossil!" Berger, accustomed to false alarms, came over to have a look. He nearly fainted. The bone his son had found was not some random antelope fossil. It was the fossilized clavicle, the collarbone, of an ancient hominin child. That single serendipitous find led to the excavation of one of the most remarkable fossil sites ever discovered, Malapa. The site itself tells a tragic story. Malapa wasn't a place where hominins lived. It was a natural death trap. 2 million years ago, this area was a network of caves. One of these caves likely had a deep vertical shaft, an opening to the surface perhaps hidden by trees and undergrowth. Animals drawn to the area, perhaps in search of water, would occasionally take a fatal misstep, plummeting to their doom in the dark chamber below. Their bodies, safe from scavengers, were then gently covered by sediment and preserved with astonishing fidelity. For the creatures who fell, it was a tragedy. For science, it was a miracle. The pit yielded several skeletons, including 2 that were stunningly complete: a juvenile male, about Matthew's age, and an adult female. Berger's team had found a new species, which they named Australopithecus Sediba. And what a strange and fascinating species it is. Sediba is the ultimate mosaic, a creature that seems to have 1 foot in the past and 1 in the future, a bewildering mix of primitive and shockingly modern features. On the primitive side, its brain was tiny, only about 420 cubic centimeters. That's smaller than the smallest Homo habilis, and squarely in the Australopithecine range. Its arms were long and ape-like, telling you it was still very comfortable in the trees. And detailed analysis of its ankle shows a primitive heel bone, suggesting a unique way of walking, where its foot would have rotated inwards with each step. But then you look at the rest of its body, and you see something startlingly modern. Its face was delicate and less projecting than other Australopithecines. Its teeth were small and human-like. The real shock, however, came from its hand. The one nearly complete hand they found is one of the most important fossils in all of human evolution. It had short fingers and a very long, powerful thumb, a hand far more specialized for the precision grip needed for tool making than the hand of Homo habilis. and its pelvis was another surprise. It was broad and short, rebuilt for a more efficient, striding bipedal gait, very different from the pelvis of a creature like Lucy. The final crucial piece of the puzzle was its age. The rock layers in which the skeletons were found could be dated with extreme precision. The mainstream historical fact is that Australopithecus Sediba lived and died almost exactly 1.98 million years ago. This timing is perfect. It places this species on the landscape at the exact moment that the earliest members of the next, more advanced grade of human, Homo erectus, were beginning to emerge. Suddenly, the simple succession of Habilis to Erectus in East Africa had a powerful challenger from the south. This beautifully preserved new find, with its bizarre combination of traits, presented a compelling alternative candidate for the role of direct ancestor to all later humans, including us. The family plot, already complicated, had just thickened considerably. The discovery of such a complete and compelling fossil as Australopithecus Sediba was never going to be a quiet affair. It didn't just add a new name to a list. It threw down a direct challenge to the entire established narrative of our origins. Lee Berger and his team did not shy away from this challenge. They laid out a bold and persuasive case. Australopithecus Sediba, they argued, was a much better candidate for the direct ancestor of the genus Homo than the confusing and fragmentary fossils of Homo habilis. Their argument asks you to look past the small brain size for a moment and consider the rest of the body, the chassis on which that brain was riding. They point to Sediba's remarkably modern pelvis, a structure already reorganized for the kind of efficient, striding gait that would allow later humans to cross continents. They highlight its hand, a near-perfect tool-making instrument, with a long thumb and short fingers that seem more adept for a precision grip than the hands of Habilis. They point to its small teeth and less projecting face, features that seem to prefigure the more delicate facial structure of later Homo. The case for Sediba is that it is a beautiful, cohesive, transitional fossil. It flows anatomically into what comes next. Homo habilis, by contrast, is a messy and contradictory creature with a jumble of primitive and advanced features that don't quite fit. Berger's argument is simple. If you're looking for the ancestor of Homo erectus, Sediba looks the part far more elegantly. But this bold proposal was met with a powerful wave of scientific skepticism from other corners of the paleoanthropological community. The critics raised two major and very serious objections to Sediba's candidacy as our direct ancestor. The first, and most significant, is the problem of timing. At just under 2 million years old, Australopithecus Sediba is, for many researchers, simply too young to be the ancestor of Homo erectus. We have fossil evidence of early Homo erectus and other transitional Homo forms in East Africa that are the same age, or in some cases, even slightly older. The fundamental rule of ancestry is that you cannot be the ancestor of your own contemporary. The critics argue that this timing makes it far more likely that Sediba is not our ancestor, but rather a late surviving specialized offshoot of the Australopithecine lineage that persisted in the south of the continent long after the main evolutionary event, the birth of Homo, had already taken place up in East Africa. This leads to the second objection, the problem of geography. As we've discussed, the Great Rift Valley of East Africa has yielded a continuous, well-dated record of hominin evolution. It is where we find the later Australopithecines, the earliest stone tools, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and the first Homo erectus. The overwhelming weight of the evidence points to East Africa as the crucible of our genus. Sediba, on the other hand, is from South Africa. While it's certainly not impossible that our lineage began in the south and then migrated north, it would require a major rewriting of the story, and right now, the fossil trail for that journey doesn't exist. Geographically, Sediba is an outlier, and so the scholarly debate rages on, a fascinating clash of evidence and interpretation. The central question remains, is Australopithecus sediba our direct ancestor, a close cousin on a side branch that ultimately went extinct? Or is it a stunning example of something called convergent evolution? Convergent evolution is what happens when two separate, unrelated lineages independently evolve similar traits because they are facing similar environmental pressures. Is it possible that the hominins in South Africa, facing the same challenges of the expanding savannah, independently evolved human-like hands, teeth, and a modern pelvis, creating a remarkable but ultimately unrelated parallel version of a human ancestor? Regardless of where Sediba ends up on our family tree, its very existence teaches us something profound. It proves that the iconic traits we associate with being human, hands built for tool making, a body built for efficient walking, a diet reflected in smaller teeth, were not a one-time only invention. They didn't appear in a single, golden, predestined lineage that was marching toward us. Nature, it seems, was experimenting. In different parts of the vast African laboratory, different populations of hominins were stumbling upon similar evolutionary solutions to the problems of survival. The path to humanity wasn't a single well-trodden road. It was a landscape of many parallel paths, most of which, like the one taken by the ghosts of Malapa, eventually faded into a dead end. All of these competing candidates and parallel paths force us to confront an image that is deeply lodged in our collective consciousness. You know the one. It's called the March of Progress. It's in museums, on book covers, and in countless cartoons. On the far left, you have a knuckle-walking, ape-like creature. It gradually stands more upright as you move to the right, passing through a series of increasingly human-like figures, until you arrive at the heroic finale on the far right, a tall, anatomically modern human, often holding a spear. It's a powerful, simple, and satisfying image. And it is completely, fundamentally, and profoundly wrong. That image isn't a ladder of progress. It's a ladder of prejudice. It implies that evolution is a linear, predetermined march towards a single, perfect goal: us. It suggests that every species along the way was just a failed rough draft, a stepping stone on the inevitable path to Homo sapiens. But that is not how evolution works. Evolution has no goal, no foresight, and no destination. It is simply a process of adaptation to immediate, local circumstances. A much better and far more accurate analogy for human evolution is not a ladder, but a dense, thorny, and tangled bush. Imagine this bush. At its base, deep in the past, is a common ancestor. As time moves forward, branches sprout from the trunk and from each other, shooting off in all directions. Each branch is a new species, a new experiment in living. Some branches are short and stubby, representing species that appeared and then quickly vanished. Other branches grow long and strong, thriving for 1,000,000 years or more, sprouting their own smaller twigs. Some branches might even grow towards each other, their leaves mingling, representing the moments when different species met and interbred. Most importantly, the vast, overwhelming majority of these branches do not lead to the tip where we are. They are their own successful stories that, for one reason or another, eventually came to an end. We are not the peak of the bush. We are just one twig on one surviving branch, that has managed to keep growing into the present day. This bushy reality leads to a conclusion that can be startling. For almost the entirety of our multi-million-year human story, it was perfectly normal for multiple distinct species of hominins to be sharing the planet at the same time. Our current condition, what you and I experience every day, is the bizarre historical anomaly. Our solitude, as the lone single species of human on the entire globe, is a very recent and unusual state of affairs. The last 40,000 years of being alone are but a brief, quiet moment at the very end of a very long and very crowded party. Just picture the cast of characters sharing the African stage around 2 million years ago. You have the original handyman, Homo habilis, in East Africa. Alongside it, you have the large-brained mystery man, Homo Rudolfensis. Down in the south, you have the strange mosaic creature, Australopithecus Sediba, and probably other late-surviving Australopithecines as well. And that's not even the whole cast. At this same time, there was another entirely different kind of hominin, a group representing one of those other, highly successful branches on the bush. This was Paranthropus boisei, famously nicknamed Nutcracker Man. This creature was a specialist. It had a massive, dish-shaped face, a bony crest running along the top of its skull like a mohawk to anchor gigantic chewing muscles, and molar teeth as big as your thumbnails. Nutcracker Man was an evolutionary experiment in supreme vegetarianism, a machine built to grind tough, fibrous roots and nuts for hours on end. And it was an incredibly successful experiment, surviving for over 1 million years. But it was not our ancestor. It was our cousin, a representative of a different path entirely. The implications of all this diversity are profound. It means that the old quest to find the one, single, missing link that connects apes to humans is a fool's errand. There isn't a neat chain to be completed. There is a messy bush to be mapped. The goal of paleoanthropology now is not to draw a straight line, but to understand the complex web of relationships between all these coexisting species, to appreciate the variety of their adaptations, and to try and figure out why, out of all those thriving branches, only our own managed to survive the final cut. This tangled bush of coexisting hominins, with its many different experimental branches, raises a crucial question. If all these species were living on the same landscape, facing the same challenges, what was the special ingredient? What was the secret sauce that allowed one of those branches, the one that would eventually lead to us, to embark on a completely new and explosive evolutionary trajectory? The answer, it seems, has less to do with what was in their hands or even in their heads, and more to do with what was in their stomachs. The key to becoming Homo was a revolution in diet. You can connect the major threads of our story so far: the changing climate, the expanding savannas, and the invention of stone tools, with this single, powerful idea. The new savanna environment was full of vast herds of grazing animals. The new stone tools, those portable butcher's kits, provided the means to process their carcasses. The dietary revolution was the moment our ancestors put these two things together, shifting from a diet based primarily on low-quality plants to one that included a significant amount of high-quality, calorie-dense, energy-rich meat and bone marrow. This was not just a new item on the menu. It was the fuel that would power the growth of the very organ that makes us human, the brain. This idea is most elegantly explained by a key scientific theory known as the expensive tissue hypothesis. Think of your body as having a strict energy budget, much like a household. Every day you take in a certain number of calories, and you have to spend them to keep all your systems running. Some of your organs are metabolically cheap, while others are incredibly expensive. Two of the most expensive tissues in your entire body are your brain and your digestive system. The hypothesis, proposed by scientists Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler, argues that there is an evolutionary trade-off. You simply cannot afford, metabolically speaking, to have both a giant, energy-hungry brain and a giant, energy-hungry gut at the same time. To grow one, you must shrink the other. Now, a long and complex gut is necessary if your diet consists of tough, fibrous, low-quality plants. You need a huge digestive tract with lots of surface area to slowly ferment and extract every last calorie. On the other hand, high-quality foods like meat and marrow are much easier to digest. They don't require a massive digestive system. So, the hypothesis goes, when our ancestors started using tools to gain access to meat, they could afford to shrink their guts. This dietary shift freed up a huge amount of metabolic energy from the household budget. And where did that surplus energy go? It went straight to the head, fueling the explosive and unprecedented growth of the brain. We traded guts for brains. We have direct scientific evidence for this dietary shift, and it's written in the chemistry of fossilized teeth. The old saying, "You are what you eat," is literally true. The chemical elements from the food you consume are incorporated into your bones and teeth as they grow. By analyzing the stable isotopes of elements like carbon in a fossil tooth, scientists can reconstruct an ancient creature's diet. It works like this. Plants that grow in forests and shady areas, like trees and shrubs, have a different carbon isotope signature than plants that grow in open, sunny areas, like savanna grasses. By using a laser to vaporize a microscopic speck of a 2-million-year-old tooth and analyzing its chemistry, we can tell if that hominin was eating forest food or if it had moved out onto the savanna. The evidence from this isotopic analysis is clear. While earlier Australopithecines show a varied diet, the teeth of early Homo show a strong and consistent signature of savanna-based foods. This is the chemical proof that our lineage had made a decisive move into the new grassland environment and was successfully exploiting the resources it found there, including the animals that ate the grass. This dietary revolution kicked off one of the most powerful positive feedback loops in the history of life. It worked like this. Better stone tools allowed our ancestors to get more meat and marrow. This higher quality diet provided the surplus energy needed to grow a bigger brain. A bigger brain, in turn, could think of better tool designs and more complex social strategies for acquiring food. These better tools and strategies led to even more high-quality food, which fueled an even bigger brain. And so the cycle continued, spiraling upwards for over 1 million years, each improvement in diet feeding brain growth, and each advance in cognition feeding a better diet. This self-reinforcing engine is what drove the rapid increase in brain size that would become the defining characteristic of our lineage. As a final quirky thought, however, you might consider that while eating raw meat was a huge step up, it's still tough to digest and carries a heavy load of pathogens. The real nutritional hack, the discovery that would supercharge this feedback loop beyond all imagining, was still a long way off. That would require taming fire and learning how to cook. That powerful feedback loop, with a better diet fueling a bigger brain which in turn developed better tools, was the engine that drove our evolution for 500,000 years. And around 1.9 million years ago, that engine, humming with a new and powerful intensity, produced a completely new model of hominin. This was not a minor upgrade. This was a quantum leap. This was a creature so radically different from its predecessors that it represents a whole new grade of human. Its name is Homo erectus. When you look at the fossils of Lucy, or even Homo habilis, you see a bipedal ape. When you look at Homo erectus, you see something startlingly familiar. For the first time in our journey, you see a being that is, in its shape and its stature, fundamentally human. The revolution begins from the neck down. The old Australopithecine body plan, with its compromise between walking and climbing, is gone. The long, powerful arms adapted for a life in the trees have vanished, replaced by arms that are short, just like yours. The legs, for the first time, are long, slender, and built for efficient, striding locomotion. The wide, flaring pelvis of the earlier hominins has narrowed, and the chest has become a deep barrel shape. Even the feet have been remodeled, now sporting a well-developed arch to act as a shock absorber during locomotion. This is a skeleton that has become fully and irrevocably committed to a life on the ground. The ties to the arboreal world have been severed. This is the body of a runner. This complete anatomical overhaul has led to one of the most compelling theories in human evolution, the endurance running hypothesis. This theory proposes that the new body of Homo erectus was a specialized adaptation for running long distances in the hot, open environments of the African savanna. Many features that you have in your own body, which we can infer in Erectus, point to this conclusion. You have a long Achilles tendon connecting your calf muscle to your heel, which acts like a powerful spring. You have huge gluteal muscles, your butt, which do very little when you walk but are critical for stabilizing your torso when you run. You have a special ligament in your neck, the nuchal ligament, that keeps your head stable and prevents it from bobbing around as you jog. And perhaps most importantly, you have a mostly hairless body with millions of sweat glands, a phenomenal cooling system that allows you to shed heat and continue exercising in the midday sun long after a fur-covered animal would have to stop or risk death from overheating. This unique set of adaptations unlocked a revolutionary new hunting strategy: persistence hunting. It's a method of predation that does not rely on speed, strength, or stealth, but on sheer, dogged endurance. Imagine a small band of Homo erectus hunters. They select an animal from a herd, perhaps a large antelope like a kudu. They don't try to sneak up on it or outrun it in a sprint. That would be impossible. Instead, they simply begin to trot after it at a steady, relentless pace. The kudu easily sprints away, but the hunters just keep coming, following its tracks, always reappearing on the horizon. The animal sprints, then rests, then sprints again. But it's a fur-covered creature, and under the blistering heat of the equatorial sun, it cannot cool down. Eventually, after a chase of many miles, the animal slows, stumbles, and collapses from hypothermia, heat exhaustion. The hunters can then walk right up and dispatch their prey with ease. This was a way to gain access to huge packages of high-quality protein, and it was a strategy that only a creature with the body of Homo erectus could employ. This new body, this new hunting strategy, and a new, more sophisticated toolkit made Homo erectus an incredible evolutionary success story. This is a mainstream historical fact you should never forget. Homo erectus, in its various forms, was one of the most successful and long-lived human species that ever existed. They survived for nearly 2 million years, from 1.9 million down to as recently as 100,000 years ago in some places. Our own species, Homo sapiens, by contrast, has only been around for about 300,000 years. We have a very long way to go to match their record. And to go with this new body, they had a new mind. The skull of Erectus shows the next major leap in brain size, with an average volume of around 900 cubic centimeters, a huge jump from Habilis. Its face was still primitive by our standards, with a heavy, beetling brow ridge that ran in a solid bar across its eyes, a long and low cranium, and a jaw that still lacked a chin. But it was a new kind of face, for a new kind of human, ready to do something no other hominin had ever done before: walk out of Africa and inherit the earth. For a long time, our picture of Homo erectus was like a composite sketch, pieced together from skulls found in Asia, jaw bones from Africa, and leg bones from Europe. We understood the general blueprint, but we had never seen a complete, integrated individual. We were missing the instruction manual for how all the parts fit together. That changed in the summer of 1984, on the arid, wind-swept western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya. A seasoned fossil hunter named Kamoya Kimeu, a key member of Richard Leakey's team, spotted a tiny, dark fragment of bone eroding from a hillside. It was a piece of a hominin skull. That small clue triggered a painstaking excavation that, over the course of 5 months, unearthed something miraculous: a nearly complete skeleton of a Homo erectus individual who had died there 1.5 million years ago. This skeleton, known as Nariokotomi boy, or more simply Turkana boy, is one of the crown jewels of the human fossil record. Its completeness, around 90% of the skeleton was recovered, was a scientific game changer. A complete skeleton is not just a collection of bones, it is a single biological machine. It provides a unique window into the past, allowing us to study anatomy, locomotion, and even the pace of life and death in a way that isolated fragments never can. For the first time, we could see in high resolution how this new kind of human was built, how it grew, and how it moved through its world. The first and most surprising thing the skeleton revealed was the boy's age and stature. He was not an adult, but a youth. And yet he was already remarkably tall, standing about 5 feet, 3 inches. This immediately raised a question. If he was this tall as a boy, how tall would he have been as a man? But first, they had to be sure of his age. This is where a remarkable piece of scientific evidence comes in. Your tooth enamel, the hard white outer layer of your teeth, grows in microscopic layers. A new layer is laid down every single day of your childhood. Much like counting the rings of a tree to find its age, scientists can slice a tooth open, put it under a microscope, and painstakingly count these daily growth lines. This technique revealed with incredible precision that Turkana boy was just 8 years old when he died. This was a profound insight. An 8-year-old boy who was already 5 feet 3 was growing up on a very different schedule from you. He was shooting up in height, but he would have reached maturity much earlier, likely in his early teens. This tells us that the pattern of development in Homo erectus was an intermediate stage between apes and modern humans. The long, extended childhood that you experienced, a period of slow growth that gives our massive brains time to develop and learn, had not yet evolved. He lived a life in fast forward, a brief childhood giving way to the rigors of a short and dangerous adulthood. As scientists studied his skeleton more closely, they noticed another subtle but fascinating detail. The holes in the middle of his vertebrae, the bony rings that form a protective channel for the spinal cord, were noticeably narrower than yours. This suggests he had a thinner spinal cord. This might not sound important, but the nerves that branch off the spinal cord in the chest region control the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, the very muscles you use for the fine breath control that is essential for modern, complex speech. This anatomical clue has led to the tantalizing suggestion that while Turkana Boy's body was modern, his nervous system might not have been. He may have been capable of making some sounds, but he likely lacked the physical capacity for the fluid, modulated and rapid speech that we take for granted. He had the body of a human, but perhaps not yet the voice. His tall stature as a youth has also been the subject of a long-running scholarly debate. The initial excitement surrounding his discovery led to projections that, had he lived to adulthood, he would have stood well over 6 feet tall, a veritable giant on the Pleistocene landscape. However, as our understanding of his accelerated growth pattern has improved, these estimates have been revised. Because we now know he would have had a shorter growth spurt than modern humans, revised calculations suggest a more modest adult height, probably around 5 feet 6 inches. This ongoing discussion is a perfect example of how science self-corrects, constantly refining the story as new data and new methods of analysis become available. Turkana Boy isn't just a fossil, he's an ongoing conversation with the deep past. While Turkana Boy's skeleton gives us a stunningly clear picture of his body, his mind remains more of a mystery. His capacity for language is a matter of intense debate, but there is another, more durable record of the cognitive world of Homo erectus. It's a record chipped and flaked from stone, and it tells a story of a profound technological and mental upgrade. For over 1 million years, the simple Oldowan chopper had been the pinnacle of technology, the only tool on the market. Then, starting around 1.7 million years ago, a new and revolutionary toolkit appears in the archaeological record, a technology so distinct and so advanced that it marks a new chapter in the human mind. This is the Acheulean industry, named after the site of Saint-Acheulean in France, where its signature tool was first identified. And that signature tool is one of the most iconic and beautiful artifacts of the deep past, the Acheulean hand axe. This was not just a sharpened rock. This was a sculpted object, a tool with a deliberate and standardized design. Typically, it is a large, symmetrical, teardrop or almond-shaped piece of stone. Unlike an Oldowan chopper, which is just a cobble with a few flakes knocked off one end, a hand axe is bifacial, meaning it has been carefully worked on both sides. The toolmaker would start with a large cobble or flake, and then, with dozens of precise strikes, thin it down, creating a continuous, sharp cutting edge that runs all the way around the tool's perimeter, culminating in a pointed tip. The creation of a hand axe represents a monumental cognitive leap. To make a simple Oldowan chopper, you just need to know how to break a rock to get an edge. To make an Acheulean hand axe, you need to have a plan. The toolmaker had to hold a specific, symmetrical, three-dimensional design, a mental template, in their mind's eye before they even began. They had to be able to look at a rough, shapeless block of flint and see the finished tool hiding inside it. Then, they had to execute a long and complex sequence of operations, turning the stone over and over, striking it in just the right place with just the right force to slowly impose that mental template onto the raw material. This requires foresight, planning, patience, and a sophisticated appreciation for symmetry that is light years beyond the smash-and-grab thinking of the first toolmakers. It is the beginning of design. This carefully designed tool was the Swiss Army knife of the Pleistocene. It was a versatile multi-tool, capable of a wide range of tasks. Its sheer weight and long, sharp edges made it a perfect, heavy-duty butcher's knife, ideal for dismembering the carcasses of large animals, slicing through thick hides and disarticulating joints. The strong, pointed tip was an effective tool for digging in hard, sun-baked earth to unearth nutritious tubers and roots. The sharp sides could be used to strip bark from trees or to shape a piece of wood into a digging stick or a sharpened spear. Some researchers have even argued that its aerodynamic shape would have made it a formidable thrown weapon, a kind of stone discus, though this remains a hotly debated topic. And yet, these practical uses don't quite solve a lingering mystery. Archaeologists sometimes find sites with hundreds, even thousands of hand axes piled together, many of them exquisitely made from beautiful, colorful stone. And here is the quirky tidbit. When you put these pristine artifacts under a microscope, they show no signs of use wear, no scratches, no chips, no polish. They were made, and then, apparently, never used. Why would a creature spend so much time and energy creating a perfect tool, only to discard it? This has led to some fascinating, if fringe, speculation. Were they a form of offering? A display of wealth or status? One of the most intriguing ideas is that they were a product of sexual selection. Perhaps a male Homo erectus, much like a peacock displaying his tail, would demonstrate his fitness, intelligence, and good genes to a potential mate by skillfully crafting a perfect symmetrical hand axe. Whatever their full meaning, there is no debating their success. The Acheulean tradition is, by any measure, the most successful technology in human history. This is a mainstream historical fact. It persisted for an almost unimaginable 1.5 million years. And as Homo erectus began to leave Africa, they carried this idea with them. Acheulean hand axes are found from the river gravels of England to the plains of India, making this the longest-lasting and most geographically widespread cultural tradition our lineage has ever known. It was a truly universal tool, the product of a new kind of mind. That new kind of mind, capable of holding a symmetrical design in its thoughts and imposing it on stone, was on the verge of grasping an even more powerful and elemental tool. This tool wasn't made of rock, but of pure energy. It was a force of nature that every creature on Earth feared, a destructive power that sent animals fleeing in terror. This new human, Homo erectus, would be the first creature in the 4-billion-year history of life to tame it. We are talking, of course, about the control of fire. This was more than just a new gadget. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of power between a single species and the rest of the natural world. It was the moment our ancestors ceased to be simply subjects of their environment and began to become its masters. For decades, the search for the first campfire was one of the most frustrating quests in archaeology. The problem is one of evidence. Imagine you are an archaeologist excavating a 2-million-year-old campsite. You find a patch of reddened baked earth, some charcoal, and a few burned animal bones. Have you found the hearth of an ancient human? Or have you simply found the spot where a lightning strike ignited a dead tree in a natural brush fire? The traces they leave in the ground can look identical. For years, numerous claims for very early fire use were announced, only to be dismissed by critics who argued, quite reasonably, that a natural origin couldn't be ruled out. To prove the controlled use of fire, you needed to find it in a place where nature could not possibly have put it. And that is exactly what scientists found, deep inside a place called Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. Wonderwerk is not a shallow rock shelter. It's a vast horizontal cavern that stretches for nearly 140 meters, like a tube running into the heart of a hillside. And it was here, in sediment layers deep inside the cave, more than 30 meters from the entrance, that archaeologists found the smoking gun. Using a technique called micromorphology, which involves studying soil and sediment under a microscope, they identified the clear traces of repeated fire events. They found microscopic fragments of burned animal bone and the delicate feathery ash of burned grasses and leaves, all mixed in with Acheulean hand axes. This is the crucial scientific evidence. The location, so deep within the pitch-black zone of the cave, ruled out a wildfire. The wind simply could not have carried burning embers that far inside. This was the work of hominins, who were carrying wood and combustible material deep into the cave to build and maintain their own fires. Dated to 1 million years ago, this is the earliest widely accepted evidence for the controlled use of fire. The mastery of fire was a Promethean gift, and it utterly transformed the human experience, offering a cascade of revolutionary benefits. The most important of these was cooking. Applying heat to food is a form of external digestion. It breaks down tough collagens in meat and softens the cell walls of plants, making them far easier to chew and digest. This unlocks a huge amount of extra calories and nutrients that would have been inaccessible in their raw form. Cooking also kills parasites and bacteria, making food much safer to eat. This was the discovery that supercharged the expensive tissue feedback loop, providing an even richer, more reliable source of energy for the ever-growing brain. But the benefits didn't stop there. Fire provided warmth, a personal, portable furnace that allowed our ancestors to survive cold nights and, eventually, to push into the frigid climates of Ice Age Europe and Asia. Fire also offered protection. Imagine the terror of a Pleistocene night, huddled in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the great predators on the prowl. Fire created a magical, flickering circle of safety. It kept the saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas at bay. It turned the tables, transforming our ancestors from terrified prey into something to be respected and even feared. And finally, fire conquered the night itself. It extended the usable day by hours, providing light to work on tools, and more importantly, to socialize. This created what we now call the social hearth. The campfire became the central magnetic point for the group. It was a place to gather, to share food, to feel safe and warm together. It's in those long, dark hours, staring into the mesmerizing dance of the flames, that many anthropologists believe the deepest foundations of our humanity were forged. This was a time for strengthening social bonds, for cooperation, and perhaps for the development of more complex communication, the first steps towards language and storytelling. While the Wonderwerk evidence is strong, you should know that archaeologists still argue about when the use of fire became a regular, habitual part of hominin life. Some believe that for hundreds of thousands of years, fire use might have been opportunistic and rare. They argue that it wasn't until much later, perhaps only 400,000 years ago, that we see hearths become a common, everyday feature at archaeological sites around the world. The taming of the flame may have been a long, slow-burning revolution. With a modern body built for endurance, a sophisticated toolkit for processing the world, and now the transformative power of fire, Homo erectus had assembled the complete package for survival and expansion. For the first time in the history of our lineage, a hominin species was not merely reacting to its environment, but was actively shaping it, creating its own pockets of warmth and safety in the darkness. They were no longer tied to the tropical cradle that had birthed them. They were ready to walk out of Africa and into the wider world, becoming the planet's first true globe-trotting pioneers. This great dispersal, which began sometime after 1.9 million years ago, is often called Out of Africa 1, and it marks the moment the human story went from being a regional African tale to a global epic. But why leave? What was the driving force behind this monumental expansion? It probably wasn't a single dramatic event or a conscious decision to go and explore. It was more likely a slow, creeping, generational process. A dispersal so gradual that no single individual would have been aware of it. The motivations were likely a mix of the practical and the instinctual. The most straightforward driver was diet. As our ancestors incorporated more and more meat into their diet, their fortunes became tied to the vast migratory herds of grazing animals. They were following the food. As the great herds of antelope, gazelle, and horses moved across the landscape in search of fresh pasture, the small bands of hominins simply moved with them. Over hundreds and then thousands of years, this slow pursuit could carry a population out of Africa and deep into Asia without any grand plan. Another key factor was simple demographic pressure. Homo erectus was a hugely successful species. Their population was growing. This would have created a constant, low-level pressure on local resources. When a group became too large, or a particular valley could no longer support them, a small family unit would simply split off and move into the next, unoccupied territory over the hill. You repeat that simple process for 10,000 generations, and a species that started in East Africa can find itself on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. And of course, we shouldn't entirely discount the simple, powerful, and deeply human drive of curiosity. What's over that next mountain range? What lies beyond that river? That innate desire to explore, to know what's next, may have been the final gentle push that propelled them into new worlds. The most likely route for this journey was a land bridge, the Sinai Peninsula, connecting northeastern Africa to the great landmass of Asia. From there, they could have followed the coastlines or the great river systems, spreading ever eastward. Another possibility is a southern route. During periods of lower sea levels in the past, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, connecting the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, would have been much narrower, possibly even crossable on foot. Whatever the path, they pushed into Asia with remarkable speed. Imagine the sheer adaptability this required. For millions of years, the hominin experience had been exclusively African and exclusively tropical. These pioneers were the first to encounter truly alien landscapes. They would have had to cross vast, arid deserts. They would have walked into temperate woodlands where the seasons changed, where the world died in the winter and was reborn in the spring. They encountered new mountain ranges, new forests, and new coastlines. They met entirely new suites of predators and had to learn the habits of entirely new prey. This expansion wasn't just a triumph of their long legs, it was a testament to the supreme flexibility and problem-solving ability of their minds. And we know they succeeded beyond all measure. This is a mainstream historical fact. The fossil remains of Homo erectus have been found scattered all across the Old World, a testament to their incredible geographic range. Some of the most famous of these finds are Peking Man, from a cave system near modern-day Beijing, China, and even further afield, Java Man, from the island of Java in Indonesia. The story of Java Man provides a quirky tidbit about the history of this science. In the 1890s, a Dutch anatomist named Eugène Dubois, inspired by Darwin's theories, specifically traveled to Southeast Asia because he believed it was the cradle of humanity. When he discovered the fossil skullcap and femur of Java Man, he declared he had found the missing link. The European scientific establishment, however, was deeply skeptical and largely rejected his claims. Dubois spent years fiercely and sometimes angrily defending his fossil's human ancestry. A lonely battle that highlights just how radical and challenging the idea of a deep human past and our connection to these ancient relatives truly was. The discovery of far-flung fossils like Java Man and Peking Man painted a picture of an incredibly successful, widespread species. For a long time, the story of their journey seemed relatively straightforward. Homo erectus, now a large-brained, long-legged, and technologically sophisticated hominin, strode confidently out of Africa and conquered the Old World. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a series of discoveries at a completely unexpected location would throw a wrench into this tidy narrative, challenging our most basic assumptions about who these first pioneers really were. The site was not in a sun-baked African gorge, but far to the north, at a place called Dmanisi, a medieval hilltop fortress in the Republic of Georgia, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Archaeologists there were initially excavating the ruins of the medieval city. But as they dug deeper into the cellars of ancient buildings, they began to find the bones of extinct Ice Age animals. And then, in 1991, they found a hominin jawbone. Further excavations revealed a treasure trove, a collection of skulls, jaws, and limb bones, all preserved in the sediments of ancient animal burrows beneath the fortress. These fossils were dated to an astonishing 1.77 million years ago, making them, by far, the oldest undisputed hominins ever found outside of Africa. They were a snapshot of the very first wave of pioneers. And what a surprising snapshot it was. The prevailing theory had been that hominins needed a full leaving Africa toolkit to survive in the new, more challenging environments of Eurasia. This meant you needed to have a large brain for complex problem solving, long legs for efficient travel, and the advanced Acheulean hand axes. The 5 individuals found at Dmanisi, now famously known as the Dmanisi 5, violated every single one of these expectations. Their bodies were small, some standing less than 5 feet tall. The tools found with them were not the sophisticated hand axes, but the simple, primitive Oldowan-style choppers and flakes, the kind of technology we associate with the much earlier Homo habilis. And most shockingly of all, their brains were tiny. The 5 skulls show a range of sizes, but some were as small as 550 cubic centimeters. That is barely larger than an Australopithecine, and squarely in the range of Homo habilis. The conclusion was unavoidable. The first humans to leave Africa were not the big, brilliant engineers of our imagination. They were small-bodied, small-brained hominins with a primitive toolkit. But the Dmanisi fossils held one more, even bigger surprise. One that would spark one of the most intense debates in modern paleoanthropology. The 5 skulls, all found in the same place at the same point in time, and therefore presumably members of the same population, showed an incredible range of physical variation. One skull, the famous Skull 5, had a massive, robust jaw and a projecting face, while another was much more delicate. One looked a bit like Homo erectus, another a bit like Homo habilis. They were all clearly related, yet they were all strikingly different. This is what led the Dmanisi research team, led by David Lord Kipanidze, to make a bombshell argument in 2013. They reasoned that if you can find this much variation, from small-brained and delicate to large-brained and robust, within a single interbreeding population, then what does that say about the fossils we've found scattered across all of Africa? We have taken similarly different-looking fossils from different locations, like Homo habilis, Homo Rudolfensis, and Homo erectus, and we have called them different species. But what if, the Dmanisi team asked, we've been mistaken? What if that variation is not between species, but simply the normal variation within a species? Their controversial conclusion was to propose lumping all of these early Homo fossils together into a single, evolving, and highly variable lineage. Homo erectus. In this view, Habilis and Rudolfensis are not separate species at all, but simply earlier, more primitive members of the Erectus family. This lumping hypothesis has become one of the most contentious issues in the field today. It has ignited a fierce scholarly debate between two camps. On one side are the lumpers, like the Dmanisi team, who argue that we have consistently underestimated the amount of normal variation within a fossil species and have created too many unnecessary names. On the other side are the splitters. They argue that the anatomical differences between, say, Habilis and Erectus are too consistent and too significant to be brushed aside as mere variation. They believe these differences reflect real, distinct species with unique evolutionary histories, and that lumping them all together is an oversimplification that masks the true, bushy nature of our past. It's a debate that goes to the very heart of how we define a species in the deep past, and it's a puzzle that the ghosts of Dmanisi have left for us to solve. Whether they were one single variable species or a whole family of them, the fact remains that these early members of the genus Homo achieved something unprecedented. They established a human presence across the vastness of the old world, from the Caucasus Mountains of Georgia to the tropical islands of Indonesia. For the first time, the story of humanity was no longer confined to Africa. Now we must imagine the lives of these globe-trotting pioneers as they spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting to the challenges of these new worlds. This was not a single monolithic culture, but a sprawling, fragmented network of populations, each learning to survive in its own unique corner of the planet. For those groups that pushed north into the temperate zones of Asia and Europe, the greatest challenge would have been something no hominin had ever truly experienced before: a real winter. For millions of years, our lineage had evolved in the tropics, where the rhythm of life is dictated by wet and dry seasons. In these new lands, they would have witnessed the world transform. They would have felt the air grow cold, seen the leaves fall from the trees, and watched as the familiar plant foods they relied on vanished for months on end. This would have demanded a revolution in planning and strategy. They needed to find reliable shelter in caves and rock overhangs. The control of fire, once a useful advantage, now became an absolute necessity for survival, a constant source of warmth against the life-threatening cold. And for the first time, they would have needed to conceive of clothing, most likely simple hides scraped clean with stone tools and draped over their bodies to conserve heat. This new world was also populated by a completely new caste of animal neighbors. The familiar fauna of the African Savannah was replaced by the strange and formidable beasts of Ice Age Eurasia. Imagine their first encounters with a woolly mammoth, a colossal shaggy creature towering over them. Picture them watching a herd of megaloceros, the giant Irish elk, with males sporting antlers that spanned 12 feet from tip to tip. They would have had to learn to live alongside and compete with formidable new predators like the massive cave bear. This required a whole new education in the ways of the wild. They had to learn the migration patterns, the behaviors, and the vulnerabilities of these new animals to have any hope of hunting them, or to avoid being hunted themselves. And we have clear scientific evidence that they did learn to become effective hunters in these new lands. At the famous cave site of Zhoukoudian near Beijing, the home of the fossils nicknamed Peking Man, archaeologists have excavated deep layers of sediment that represent a long and continuous occupation by Homo erectus. Mixed in with their tools are the fossilized bones of many different animals. Crucially, these are not just the remains of small, easily captured prey. The bones show that the inhabitants of Zhoukoudian were successfully hunting medium and even large-sized game, such as wild horses and several species of deer. This shows a clear progression from the opportunistic scavenging of their African ancestors. They were now capable, coordinated predators, able to adapt their hunting strategies to the specific challenges of their new environment. As these pioneering populations spread out across the vastness of Eurasia, they became separated from one another by immense distances. A group living in what is now Spain would have had no contact with a group living in China. Over hundreds of thousands of years of this profound isolation, the different regional populations began to drift apart, both genetically and physically. This process, known as regional evolution, meant that they started to develop their own unique anatomical quirks, subtle adaptations to their local environments. The Peking Man fossils, for instance, are known for having unusually thick bones in their skulls, a distinct local trait not seen in their African or Georgian relatives. These scattered populations were no longer a single, interbreeding group. They were beginning to walk down their own, separate evolutionary paths, laying the groundwork for the different kinds of humans who would come next. What is most astonishing about this entire period is the incredible stability of their way of life. For well over 1 million years, Homo erectus and its descendants lived and thrived across 3 continents. Their relatively simple but incredibly effective toolkit, combined with their intelligence and supreme adaptability, was a winning formula. They created a stable, enduring, and global human presence that lasted for a length of time that is almost impossible for us to truly comprehend. This was not a brief chapter in the human story. This was the bulk of the book, a long and successful reign that created the foundation upon which all the human diversity to come would be built. That long, stable reign of Homo erectus across the Old World was not a static period. Evolution was always at work, and over hundreds of thousands of years, those scattered, isolated populations began to change. The stage was being set for the next act in the human drama, an act that would feature new, even more formidable kinds of humans. This period, from about 700,000 down to 200,000 years ago, is often called the muddle in the middle by paleoanthropologists. It's a time when the fossil record gets complex, and the lines between species become incredibly blurry. Fossils from Africa, Europe, and Asia show a confusing mosaic of traits. Some still look like Homo erectus, while others have features that are clearly more advanced. Out of this muddle, a new, more robust and larger-brained species emerges, a species that is now seen as the heir to Erectus and the direct ancestor to us. Its name is Homo heidelbergensis. This species holds a pivotal place in our family tree. Homo heidelbergensis is widely considered to be the last common ancestor of the two most famous lineages of humanity, the Neanderthals and modern humans. You can picture a great branching event happening around 500,000 years ago. The populations of Heidelbergensis that were living in the cold, challenging environments of Europe and Western Asia were set on an evolutionary path that would, over the next few 100,000 years, lead to the specialized features of the Neanderthals. Meanwhile, the populations of Heidelbergensis that remained in Africa were on a different path, one that would eventually give rise to our own species, Homo sapiens. So, when you look at the face of a Heidelbergensis reconstruction, you are looking at the face of your direct ancestral species. They are the grandparents of us all, and what a formidable grandparent they were. The most dramatic change from Erectus was another major expansion of the brain. The cranial capacity of Heidelbergensis surged upwards, with an average volume falling somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 cubic centimeters. This is well within the modern human range, and some individual skulls are even larger than the average person's today. Their skulls were a fascinating mix of the old and the new. They still had a massive, heavy brow ridge, though it was often double-arched rather than a straight bar. Their faces were broad, and their jaws were powerful. But behind that primitive-looking face, the brain case was higher and more rounded, beginning to approach the shape of a modern skull. Their skeletons were incredibly robust and powerful, built for a physically demanding and dangerous life. We know this species from a range of important sites across Europe and Africa. The mainstream historical fact is that the species gets its name from its very first fossil, a massive lower jaw found in a sand pit near Heidelberg, Germany, way back in 1907. Other famous faces of this species include the stunningly complete Petrolona skull from Greece and, most spectacularly, an incredible collection of fossils from a deep cave in Spain's Atapuerca Mountains. The evidence from these sites shows that their bigger brains were being put to good use. These were not just scavengers. They were highly skilled, coordinated hunters of large and dangerous animals. The most spectacular proof of this comes from a coal mine in Schöningen, Germany. There, preserved in the soft 400,000-year-old mud of an ancient lakeside, archaeologists found a collection of wooden spears. These were not just sharpened sticks. They were a set of 8 beautifully crafted throwing spears carved from the trunks of spruce trees. They were expertly balanced, with the center of gravity and weight concentrated at the front, just like a modern javelin, to give them a stable, accurate flight. The discovery of these spears, alongside the butchered remains of dozens of horses, was undeniable proof that Homo heidelbergensis was engaging in sophisticated cooperative hunts. But perhaps the most tantalizing clues they left behind come from that deep cave in the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain, a site known as the Cima de los Huesos, or the Pit of Bones. Here, at the bottom of a 43-foot vertical shaft, archaeologists found the jumbled remains of at least 28 different Heidelbergensis individuals, males and females, adults and children. And mixed in with these thousands of human bones, they found only one single, solitary tool, a stunning, unused hand axe made from a beautiful and unusual piece of reddish quartzite. This has created a profound mystery. How did all these bodies end up in this one inaccessible pit? And why was this one special tool, which some have nicknamed Excalibur, the only artifact found with them? One controversial but powerful interpretation is that we are looking at the very first stirrings of symbolic thought and ritual. Perhaps this pit was a sacred place, and this community was deliberately depositing its dead here, dropping them into the darkness below, maybe even with a symbolic offering. This is the first faint whisper of a mind that is beginning to grapple with the concepts of death, ritual, and a world beyond the purely practical. As the lineage of Homo heidelbergensis in Africa began its slow journey towards becoming us, the populations in Europe and Asia embarked on a different path. Over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by the relentless freeze and thaw of the ice ages, they evolved into a new and iconic kind of human. They are, without a doubt, the most famous of all our extinct relatives, a name that has become a synonym for all things primitive and brutish. It is time to meet the Neanderthals, and the very first thing we must do is throw out the cartoon caricature that you have in your head. Forget the stooped, hairy, club-wielding brute. That image is a historical accident, a fiction born from a combination of bad luck and old-fashioned prejudice. The very first Neanderthal skeleton to be fully reconstructed, a French specimen known as the Old Man of La Chapelle, happened to be the remains of an individual who was not only old, but also crippled by a severe case of arthritis. The scientist who studied him in the early 20th century mistakenly interpreted his disease-ridden posture as typical for his species, creating the iconic image of the hunched, shuffling caveman. This scientific error was then amplified by a popular desire to see our extinct cousins as inferior, as clumsy, failed rough drafts on the inevitable march of progress towards the perfection of ourselves. The reality, as we now know from a century of further discoveries, is far more impressive and far more interesting. The Neanderthals, or Homo neanderthalensis, were not failures. They were the masters of their world, a highly intelligent and supremely adapted species that thrived across Eurasia, from Britain to Siberia, for over 300,000 years. They were survivors, enduring and flourishing in the brutal, fluctuating climates of the Ice Age, an environment far harsher than anything our own species had to deal with for most of its history. Their entire anatomy was a masterclass in adaptation to the cold. Their bodies were shorter, stockier, and more powerfully built than ours. Their barrel-shaped chests and short limbs followed simple biological principles for conserving heat. A thermos is short and wide, while a tall, thin glass cools down quickly. Their bones were incredibly thick, and their muscle attachments show they possessed immense physical strength. Their faces were also uniquely adapted. They had a large, projecting nasal cavity, which would have acted like a radiator, warming and humidifying the frigid, dry Ice Age air before it hit their sensitive lungs. They had the classic, heavy, double-arched brow ridge, and their cheekbones were swept back, giving their midface a pulled-forward appearance. Their skull was long and low, not high and rounded like ours, with a distinctive bulge at the back called an occipital bun. And inside that skull was a brain that was, on average, slightly larger than your own. Their intelligence is reflected in their sophisticated culture. They created an advanced toolkit known as the Mousterian industry. This often involved a complex method of tool-making called the Levallois technique, where they would meticulously prepare a stone core to a specific convex shape, almost like sculpting a turtle shell. Then, with a single, perfectly placed strike, they could detach a flake that was already in its finished form, a perfect point or a sharp scraper. This required incredible foresight and skill. They were also apex predators, their skeletons often showing the kinds of healed fractures you see on modern rodeo riders, suggesting they were engaging in dangerous close-quarters hunts of the largest Ice Age game, like mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant cave bears, likely using heavy, fire-hardened thrusting spears. And they were not the brutish loners of myth. Remember the old man of La Chapelle? The new interpretation of his skeleton tells a story of compassion. The fact that this individual lived to an old age, despite his crippling arthritis and having lost most of his teeth, means his social group was actively caring for him, perhaps even chewing his food for him, keeping him alive long after he could have fended for himself. This is the beginning of a truly human morality. The scientific evidence for their symbolic inner lives has also grown immensely. We now know they used mineral pigments like red ochre and black manganese. They collected eagle talons and perforated seashells, which they likely wore as jewelry. And we have undeniable proof that they deliberately buried their dead, placing the bodies of their loved ones in prepared graves. And yet, there is still a fascinating scholarly debate. The extent of Neanderthal symbolic and artistic capabilities is a hotbed of discussion. While evidence for personal ornamentation is growing, definitive proof of things like cave art or complex symbolic systems, like those created by early Homo sapiens, remains elusive. This has led some researchers to argue that while Neanderthals were clearly our cognitive equals in many ways, there may have still been a subtle but crucial gap between our two species, perhaps in the realm of the kind of abstract, networked thinking that underpins large-scale mythology and art. They were a different, parallel, and ultimately brilliant version of humanity. While the Neanderthals were dominating the western half of Eurasia, a vast and still poorly understood human story was unfolding in the east. For a long time, the fossil record from Asia was sparse, leaving the story of its ancient inhabitants largely untold. We knew that Homo erectus had been there for over 1 million years, but who came after them? The answer would come not from a spectacular new skeleton, but from a piece of bone no bigger than a pea, and from a scientific revolution that allowed us to read the ghost stories written in our own DNA. Our journey now takes us to a place called Denisova Cave, a remote rock shelter in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. This cave is a special place, a crossroads of the ancient world that was occupied on and off for hundreds of thousands of years. For decades, Russian archaeologists had been patiently excavating its deep, stratified layers, unearthing a rich record of stone tools from different periods. They also found a handful of tiny, frustratingly unidentifiable hominin bone fragments. In 2008, they found another one, the distal phalanx, the very tip of a child's pinky finger. It was a tiny, seemingly insignificant fossil, but this little bone was about to rewrite human history. The fragment was sent to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, to the laboratory of a geneticist named Svante Pääbo. Pääbo and his team were the pioneers of a new, almost miraculous field of science, the study of ancient DNA. They had developed techniques to extract and sequence the degraded, shattered fragments of genetic material that can sometimes survive in fossils for tens of thousands of years. They drilled a tiny amount of powder from the pinky bone, and through a long and painstaking process, they managed to reconstruct its mitochondrial DNA sequence. The team fully expected the sequence to match that of a Neanderthal, as Neanderthal tools had been found in the cave. But it didn't. They then managed to sequence the full nuclear genome, and the result was a bombshell. The DNA did not belong to a Neanderthal, nor did it belong to an early modern human. It was something entirely different. It was a new, previously unknown branch of the human family tree, a lineage that had split from the Neanderthal branch hundreds of thousands of years in the past. They were a distinct third type of human, With no skeleton to name, they were simply called the Denisovans, after the cave where their ghost was first detected. This discovery represented a complete paradigm shift in how we study the past. For a century and a half, since the discovery of the first Neanderthals, we had found our ancient relatives by their bones. You find a skull, you measure it, you describe its unique features, and you give it a name. The Denisovans turned that entire process on its head. They are the first human species in history to be discovered and defined not by their physical anatomy, but by their genome. We knew, with incredible precision, who they were genetically before we had any real idea of what they looked like. They were a ghost lineage, a spectral presence in the human story, revealed only by the molecular echo of their existence. To this day, the physical evidence for this entire population of humans remains incredibly scarce. From Denisova Cave itself, we have only that pinky bone, 3 enormous molar teeth that suggest they had very large, robust jaws, and a fragment of a skull. The only other major fossil identified as Denisovan was found thousands of miles away, in a cave high on the Tibetan plateau. It is a 160,000-year-old jawbone, and its discovery, confirmed through protein analysis, was a crucial clue, suggesting that Denisovans were biologically adapted to life in high-altitude, low-oxygen environments. And yet, we know they were not just a few scattered bands of mountain dwellers. The most stunning revelation comes from the DNA of living people. Genetic analysis has shown that modern human populations in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and Aboriginal Australia carry a significant percentage, up to 5%, of Denisovan DNA. This can only mean one thing. The Denisovans must have been widespread all across Asia, from the frozen north of Siberia, through the high plateaus of Tibet, and all the way down into the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia. It was here that they met the ancestors of modern humans as they migrated into the region, and it was here that they mixed and interbred. As a final quirky thought, just try to imagine the scene in Svante Pääbo's lab. Imagine staring at a sequence of genetic code on a computer screen. A long string of A's, C's, T's, and G's. And slowly, as you check the data, the unbelievable truth dawns on you. You are the first person in history to see the proof of a lost branch of humanity. You are looking at the blueprint of a ghost, a kind of human no one ever knew existed. It must have been a moment of pure, spine-tingling discovery. A moment when the story of our past suddenly got a whole lot bigger and more mysterious. The discovery of the Denisovans, a ghost species revealed by a whisper of DNA, proved that the human story in Asia was far more complex than we ever imagined. But that vast continent, a laboratory of evolution for over 1 million years, held yet another secret. A chapter so strange and unexpected, it reads more like a fantasy novel than a scientific paper. To find it, we must journey south to the tropical volcanic islands of Indonesia, to a place called Flores. Here, in a world that time seemed to forget, another entirely different kind of human survived. A creature that would challenge our most fundamental ideas about what a human is supposed to look like. Our story takes us to a vast, cathedral-like limestone cave called Liang Bua. In 2003, a team of Indonesian and Australian archaeologists were digging there, searching for the remains of the first anatomically modern humans to colonize the island. As they dug through the layers of the cave floor, they unearthed a skeleton. But it was not what they were looking for. It was the skeleton of a fully adult female, but she was tiny, standing barely 3.5 feet tall. The team, stunned and bemused, gave her an affectionate nickname that would stick: the Hobbit. When the full details of this new species, officially named Homo floresiensis, were revealed, they sent a shockwave through the scientific world. The tiny body was strange enough, but the real paradox was the size of her brain. Her skull housed a brain of only about 400 cubic centimeters. To put that in perspective, that is the same size as the brain of a modern chimpanzee. It's significantly smaller than the brain of Homo habilis, and even smaller than the brain of Lucy, our Australopithecine ancestor from 3 million years earlier. This seemed to completely reverse the defining trend of human evolution, the relentless march towards a bigger brain. And yet, this tiny-brained creature was found buried in the same layers as a collection of sophisticated stone tools and the butchered remains of a pygmy elephant-like animal called a stegodon. This was the Hobbit's paradox. A creature with the brain of an ape was apparently living the life of a human, hunting, making complex tools, and thriving. To explain this bizarre evolutionary puzzle, scientists turned to a well-known phenomenon called insular dwarfism, or the island rule. On remote islands, the normal rules of evolution can get weird. Islands are often resource-limited and lack large predators. In this environment, large-bodied animals, like elephants, often evolve to become smaller over many generations, because a smaller body requires fewer calories to survive. The leading hypothesis is that a population of the large-bodied, large-brained Homo erectus, who we know lived on nearby Java, must have become stranded on the island of Flores hundreds of thousands of years ago. Isolated in this unique ecological laboratory, they began to shrink, their bodies and, most shockingly, their brains, becoming smaller and more energy efficient over time. The scientific evidence supporting this theory lies in the other creatures they shared their island world with. The archaeologists at Liangbua didn't just find the remains of tiny humans. They found the remains of a whole bizarre island ecosystem. In the same layers, they found the bones of the dwarf stegodon, an animal descended from full-sized elephants that had shrunk to the size of a cow. They also found evidence of giant rats and a massive, stork-like bird that would have stood nearly as tall as the hobbits themselves. The fact that other species on the island were also subject to these strange evolutionary pressures makes it much more likely that the hobbits were not a fluke, but a product of this unique island environment. Of course, such a radical discovery was initially met with fierce controversy. A vocal group of scientists argued that the hobbit skeleton was not a new species at all, but the remains of a modern Homo sapiens who had suffered from a pathological condition like microcephaly, a developmental disorder that results in a small brain and head. This scholarly debate raged for years. However, the discovery of the remains of multiple other tiny individuals at the site made the disease hypothesis less likely. The final nail in the coffin for that idea came from a detailed analysis of the hobbit's wrist bones. They showed a primitive ape-like structure that is fundamentally different from the wrist of any modern human, healthy or otherwise. This solidified the hobbit's status as a true, distinct, and incredibly strange human species. And the final mind-bending fact about these real-life hobbits is their age. The layers in which they were found show that they survived on this island until as recently as 50,000 years ago. This is not the deep, archaic past. This is yesterday in geological terms. It means that when the first bands of our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, were making their way through the Indonesian archipelago, using boats to hop from island to island, this lost world of tiny, small-brained humans was still there. It is almost certain that our species came face to face with this other, utterly alien kind of humanity. Just when it seemed the human family bush could not possibly sprout a stranger branch than the hobbits of Flores, another discovery, back in the cradle of humankind in South Africa, would reveal a new species so enigmatic and a mystery so profound that it continues to challenge our most fundamental definitions of human behavior. This chapter of our story begins not with a scientist, but with a pair of adventurous recreational cavers in 2013, exploring the dark, labyrinthine passages of the Rising Star cave system. The two men, Rick Hunter and Stephen Tucker, were mapping the cave when they found a passage that was not on any existing chart. The journey that followed was not for the faint of heart. They had to belly crawl through a long, tight squeeze known as Superman's Crawl. Then they had to scale a sheer 40-foot rock wall called the Dragon's Back. At the top of this wall, they found a small, hidden opening, the entrance to a final, vertical chute. This chute was impossibly narrow, less than 8 inches wide in some places, a passage so tight you would have to exhale just to get through. They dropped down into the darkness below, and when they stood up and their headlamps cut through the absolute black, they saw a sight that no human had seen for 250,000 years. The floor of the chamber was not rock or mud. It was a carpet of bones. And they were not animal bones. They were human. What they had found was a fossil treasure trove, a chamber containing over 1,500 individual hominin fossils, representing at least 15 individuals. The excavation, led once again by Lee Berger, was an incredible feat, requiring a specially recruited team of slender female scientists, nicknamed the Underground Astronauts, who were small enough to fit through that perilous final chute. The creature they recovered was another new species, which they named Homo naledi. And like Sediba before it, Naledi was a bizarre mosaic of primitive and modern traits, but in a completely different combination. Its upper body seemed to be a relic from the deep past. It had a tiny brain, averaging only around 500 cubic centimeters, firmly in the Homo habilis range, and smaller than many gorillas. Its shoulders were shaped for climbing, and its fingers were long and curved, like an Australopithecines. Its pelvis was also primitive, flaring out to the sides. But from the waist down, it looked shockingly modern. Its legs were long and slender, and its feet were virtually indistinguishable from your own, perfectly adapted for a modern, striding, upright walk. It was a creature with the torso of an ancient climber and the legs of a modern marathon runner, all topped with a tiny orange-sized brain. But the anatomy of Homo naledi was not the biggest mystery. The central burning question was simple. How did all of those bones, from individuals of all ages, infants, juveniles, and adults, get into this incredibly remote, pitch-black, and almost inaccessible chamber? The simple explanations were quickly ruled out. There were no carnivore tooth marks on the bones, so they weren't dragged in by hyenas or leopards. The bones were carefully distributed, not jumbled together in the way they would be if they had been washed in by a flood. And exhaustive exploration has revealed no other, easier entrance. This led Lee Berger and his team to propose a stunning and deeply controversial hypothesis. They argued that the evidence could only point to one conclusion, that Homo naledi, despite its tiny brain, was deliberately and repeatedly carrying its dead deep into this dark and dangerous cave system, and intentionally depositing them in this chamber. This is the hypothesis of intentional body disposal. It implies a level of behavior, planning, cooperation, navigation in the dark, which would almost certainly require the use of fire, and a complex emotional or symbolic relationship with death that we had previously thought was the exclusive domain of large-brained species like Neanderthals and ourselves. This hypothesis, as you can imagine, is the subject of an intense and ongoing scholarly debate. Many critics argue that it is simply not plausible for such a small-brained creature to have engaged in such complex, modern-seeming behavior. They contend that there must be another explanation that we haven't found yet. A hidden, now collapsed entrance, or some unusual geological process that could have accumulated the bodies over time. The recent, even more controversial claims from Berger's team of hearths and possible rock engravings found within the cave system have only added fuel to this fiery debate. And then came the final shocking twist to the Naledi story: its age. Based on its primitive features, everyone assumed it must be very old, perhaps a contemporary of Homo habilis. But when the dating results finally came back, they were unbelievable. The remains of Homo naledi are only between 335,000 and 236,000 years old. This is astonishing. It means this primitive-looking, small-brained species was not a distant ancestor, but a contemporary. It was living in the hills of South Africa at the very same time that our own species, Homo sapiens, was taking its first evolutionary steps on the very same continent. At the dawn of our own kind, we were not alone. While all of these fascinating human experiments were playing out across the globe, the Neanderthals in Europe, the Denisovans in Asia, the hobbits on their lost island, and the mysterious Naledi in their South African cave, something new was brewing back in the African cradle. The lineage of Homo heidelbergensis that had remained in the homeland was continuing its own evolutionary journey. And around 300,000 years ago, this journey culminated in the emergence of a new species, one with a strangely delicate skeleton, a high, rounded head, and an unprecedented capacity for innovation. It is time for our own grand entrance onto the world stage. It is time to meet Homo sapiens. The first dawn of our species can be traced to a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. The fossils found there, dated to just over 300,000 years ago, are the oldest known members of our lineage. But if you were to meet them, you would notice they weren't quite identical to people today. They had our faces, flat and tucked beneath their foreheads. But their brain cases were still long and low, more like the archaic shape of their heidelbergensis ancestors. This was the beginning of our species, but the final modern form had not yet been perfected. So what physically made us different? When you strip everything else away, the anatomical definition of a modern human is surprisingly subtle. It really comes down to the shape of our skull. Unlike the long, low, football-shaped cranium of a Neanderthal or an early sapiens, our skull is globular, meaning it's high, short, and rounded, more like a soccer ball. This change in shape reflects a fundamental reorganization of the brain within, particularly an expansion of the parietal and temporal lobes, areas associated with sensory integration, memory, and language. We also have that flat face, and for reasons scientists still debate, a feature unique to our species among all hominins, a prominent bony chin. But the real revolution, the thing that truly set our species apart, was not in our bones, but in our minds. For the first 200,000 years of our existence, the archaeological record left behind by early Homo sapiens in Africa is, frankly, not that remarkable. Their stone tools are very similar to those being made by Neanderthals in Europe. But then, starting around 70,000 years ago and really taking off after 50,000 years ago, something extraordinary happens. We see a creative explosion in the archaeological record, a sudden flourishing of technology and symbolism that has been called the Great Leap Forward. The toolkit of these new, behaviorally modern sapiens was unlike anything that had come before. They developed new techniques to produce long, slender stone blades, which could then be modified into a huge variety of specialized tools, like a modern woodworker's shop. They began to use new materials, like bone, ivory, and antler, to craft fine sewing needles with tiny drilled eyes and deadly barbed harpoons for hunting fish. They invented the first true projectile weapons, like the spear thrower or atlatl, a device that could launch a dart with incredible force and accuracy, allowing them to hunt dangerous animals from a safe distance. They formed long-distance trade networks, evidenced by seashells and exotic stone found hundreds of miles from their source. And above all, they began to fill their world with art and symbols. They crafted personal ornaments like necklaces from beads made of shell and ostrich egg. They carved beautiful portable figurines from mammoth ivory. And in the deep, dark, silent caves of Europe and Asia, they painted the walls with breathtaking murals of the animal world they shared. What was the catalyst for this cognitive revolution? While we can't know for sure, many researchers believe the secret weapon, the final piece of the puzzle that unlocked our species' potential, was the development of fully modern, complex, syntactical language. While other hominins almost certainly had forms of communication, our language is a system of unparalleled power. It allows us to share vast and detailed amounts of information, not just about the here and now, but about the past and the future. It allows us to tell stories, to create shared myths, to establish rules, and to cooperate with a flexibility and on a scale that was previously impossible. This leads to what is called cumulative culture, where innovations are not lost, but are passed down and built upon from one generation to the next, leading to an exponential curve of technological and social complexity. Armed with this new cognitive toolkit, this new hardware in our skulls, and new software in our minds, Homo sapiens began its second great expansion out of Africa, starting around 60,000 years ago. This time, the migration would be different. This time, our species would not just adapt to new lands, it would conquer them. This wave of modern humans would spread to every habitable corner of the planet, and in their wake, one by one, all the other kinds of humans who had populated the world for so long would vanish forever. For a long time, the story of what happened when our ancestors left Africa and met these other human populations seemed simple and a little bleak. The archaeological record showed a clear pattern. Wherever Homo sapiens arrived, the archaic humans who had lived there for millennia, like the Neanderthals, soon vanished. This led to a straightforward model called complete replacement. In this story, our species, armed with superior technology, intellect, and language, simply outcompeted and replaced everyone else, driving them to extinction without a second thought. It was a story of conquest. But within the last decade, a scientific revolution has revealed a far more intimate, complex, and fascinating truth. The final chapter of their story is also the first chapter of ours, and it is written not in stone, but in the code of our own DNA. The revolution was led by the Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute. They took on a task that was once considered science fiction: to reconstruct the entire genome of an extinct species from the degraded, contaminated, and shattered fragments of DNA that can sometimes survive in ancient bones. Imagine trying to reassemble a multi-volume encyclopedia after it has been shredded into millions of confetti-sized pieces, left out in the rain for 40,000 years, and then thoroughly mixed with the shredded pages of every newspaper and magazine that has been published since. That is the scale of the challenge. Yet through years of painstaking work and technological innovation, they did it. In 2010, they published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome. The next step was to compare this ancient genetic blueprint to the genomes of people living today. And the result was one of the most stunning discoveries in the history of science. They found that every person on the planet today whose recent ancestry is from outside of sub-Saharan Africa carries Neanderthal DNA. On average, between 1 and 2% of your genome is of direct Neanderthal origin. The implications were immediate and undeniable. This is now a mainstream historical fact. Our Homo sapiens ancestors did not just replace the Neanderthals. They met them, they lived alongside them, and they had children with them. For a time, somewhere in the ancient Middle East after our ancestors first left Africa, our two lineages merged. It proved that these groups, which we had long classified as separate species, were, at least for a time, biologically compatible. They were not just our cousins, they became part of our direct ancestry. Having cracked the Neanderthal code, the team then turned their attention to the genome they had recovered from that tiny pinky bone from Denisova Cave. They ran the same comparison and found another, equally stunning pattern. They found traces of Denisovan DNA in modern humans, but with a completely different geographical distribution. Today, the highest concentrations of Denisovan DNA are found in the indigenous peoples of Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and Australia, who can carry up to 5% of this ancient genetic legacy. This was the proof of a second, completely separate interbreeding event that must have taken place somewhere in Southeast Asia as the ancestors of these populations moved through the region. This flood of genetic data has completely overturned the old story. The idea of complete replacement is now dead. In its place, we have a new model, often called leaky replacement, or assimilation. The story is still one of replacement. The vast majority of your DNA, more than 95%, does trace back to that founding population of Homo sapiens that left Africa. But the replacement was leaky. As our ancestors spread across the world, they encountered these archaic human populations that had lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, and as they mixed, they absorbed small but significant amounts of their DNA. We are, in a very real sense, the last surviving hybrid of the ancient human world. And this was not just a random quirk of history. This ancient inheritance was a profound evolutionary gift. The Neanderthals and Denisovans had been living in Eurasia for millennia. They were already well adapted to the local diseases, the colder climates, and the different diets. Interbreeding with them was an evolutionary shortcut. It was like a software update for our immune systems. Many of the Neanderthal genes that non-Africans carry today are involved in regulating the immune system, providing a pre-packaged defense against local pathogens. Similarly, a specific gene variant that helps modern Tibetans thrive in the low oxygen environment of the high plateau was inherited directly from the Denisovans. Our cousins gave us the tools to adapt and survive in their world. Their legacy is not just in the ground. It is written in the very fabric of our cells, a living ghost of the humans who came before us. The revelation that we carry the ghosts of these other humans within our own cells creates a profound and difficult paradox. If our ancestors were meeting the Neanderthals and Denisovans, and in some cases seeing them as partners, then where did they all go? Why did their stories come to an end, while ours is the only one that continued? This is the final, great, and perhaps most haunting mystery of our journey. As we look at the timeline of the deep past, a stark and unavoidable pattern emerges. The hobbits of Flores seem to vanish from their island around 50,000 years ago. The Neanderthals, after a reign of 300,000 years, fade from the European fossil record around 40,000 years ago. The Denisovans disappear at some unknown time after that. The timing is stark. Within a few thousand years of Homo sapiens arriving in any given region of the planet, the archaic humans who had lived there for millennia go extinct. Why? Why, after millions of years of diversity, are we the last human standing? There is no single, easy answer, but scientists have proposed several powerful theories that likely all played a part in this great disappearance. The first, and perhaps most obvious, is the theory of direct competition. Our ancestors, arriving from Africa, were not just another human. As we've seen, they were armed with a new and revolutionary cognitive toolkit. They had projectile weapons like spear throwers that allowed them to kill from a safe distance, a huge advantage over the close-quarters hunting techniques of the Neanderthals. They had larger, more complex social networks, allowing them to cooperate and share information in bigger groups. They had sophisticated language. In this view, we were simply a superior competitor. We out-hunted them, out-thought them, and outbred them, taking over the best territories and pushing them into marginal lands where they slowly starved into extinction. It's even possible there was direct violence, though this is incredibly difficult to prove from the archaeological record. A second theory points the finger not at our own actions, but at the planet itself. The period between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, when this transition was happening, was one of the most volatile and unstable climatic periods of the last ice age. There were massive, rapid swings in temperature that would have dramatically altered the ecosystems to which species like the Neanderthals were so well adapted. Perhaps their populations were already under immense stress, their numbers dwindling as the landscapes they knew changed around them. In this scenario, the arrival of a new, incredibly adaptable human species from the south was not the primary cause of their extinction, but simply the final push, the last straw for a population that was already on the brink. A third, and perhaps more peaceful, if equally tragic scenario, is that of assimilation. We know that we interbred with them. Perhaps their disappearance was not a story of a great war or a climatic catastrophe, but simply a matter of demographics. It's very likely that the waves of modern humans migrating out of Africa were far larger in number than the existing archaic populations. The smaller Neanderthal and Denisovan groups could have been slowly and systematically absorbed into the much larger sapiens gene pool. Over thousands of years of interbreeding, their unique physical features and genetic signatures would have been diluted, fading away not with a bang, but with a whisper, as they were genetically swamped by the newcomers. Finally, there is a chilling and powerful biological argument: the theory of pathogens. When European colonists arrived in the Americas, they brought with them diseases like smallpox and measles, which tore through the indigenous populations who had no evolved immunity. It's possible a similar story played out in the Ice Age. Homo sapiens, coming out of a long history in tropical Africa, would have been carrying a host of tropical diseases and parasites to which the Eurasian hominins, who had been separated from that environment for 500,000 years, would have had no defense. We may have inadvertently unleashed waves of epidemics that decimated their populations, long before we ever had to compete with them for a single cave or a single reindeer. We may have won the war for the planet not with our spears, but with our germs. In the end, there is almost certainly no one single verdict. The extinction of our human cousins was likely a complex and drawn-out tragedy, a death by 1,000 cuts. The true cause was probably a grim cocktail of all these factors, playing out differently in different regions. In some valleys, it may have been violent conflict. In others, it may have been a new disease. Across the board, climate change was likely a relentless pressure, and everywhere, the steady demographic tide of the newcomers would have been a factor. The story of why we are alone is not a simple whodunit, but a complex drama of competition, climate, and contagion, the full, heartbreaking details of which are lost to the silence of the deep past. And so, we find ourselves at the end of this long and tangled story, the lone survivors of a human family that was once as diverse as any other group of successful mammals. We stand on a planet that was once home to a whole spectrum of human possibilities, and this brings us full circle, right back to the question we started with on the shores of that ancient African lake. What does it truly mean to be human? If our journey through the deep past has taught us anything, it is that all the simple answers are wrong. The neat lines we try to draw in the sand are constantly washed away by the tide of new evidence. For generations, we tried to define ourselves by a single, heroic trait. Was it walking on two legs? We now know the Australopithecines had perfected that millions of years before our genus was even born. Was it the invention of tools, our supposed cerebral Rubicon? We now know that other, smaller-brained hominins were striking stones together almost 1 million years before the first Habilis. Was it a large brain? The Neanderthals, our supposedly brutish cousins, had brains that were, on average, even larger than our own. Was it culture, compassion for the elderly, the burial of the dead, or the use of personal ornaments? The Neanderthals did all of that, too. The fossil record is a long and humbling lesson that there is no single, simple feature, no anatomical silver bullet that cleanly separates us from all the humans who came before. Perhaps, then, we have been searching for the wrong thing. Perhaps the definition of humanity isn't a single trait you can point to in a fossil, but a suite of more subtle characteristics, a new way of living in the world. Modern science is beginning to propose new, more nuanced definitions. One is the pace of our development. We humans have an extraordinarily long and helpless childhood, a period of slow growth that allows our massive brains the time they need to wire themselves, to learn, and to absorb the complexities of culture. Another is our capacity for cumulative culture. Our sophisticated language allows us to pass knowledge down through the generations with incredible fidelity, allowing each new generation to build upon the innovations of the last, creating an ever-accelerating curve of complexity. And finally, there is our hypersociality, our unprecedented ability to cooperate flexibly in massive groups of genetically unrelated individuals, a feat made possible by our unique capacity to create and believe in shared stories, myths, and laws. Ultimately, the story of human evolution is not the story of a ladder, but of a spectrum. Humanity was not a sudden event, but a gradual becoming. The many species we have met on our journey tonight were not failed experiments or missing links. They were intelligent, successful, and feeling beings who were profoundly human in their own right. They were all valid, alternative answers to the question of how to survive and thrive on this planet. From the dogged endurance of Homo erectus to the cold, adapted wisdom of the Neanderthals, each represented a different and remarkable form of humanity. What then is our final place in this story? Perhaps what is unique about Homo sapiens is not that we possess any single new trait, but that we took all of these developing human characteristics, the sociality, the tool use, the intelligence, the culture, and turbocharged them with a new kind of abstract, symbolic, and networked thinking. It was this final cognitive ignition that allowed us to build the global, interconnected world that you are living in right now. The story of all the humans who came before us is not a separate story. It is the long, deep, and complex prologue to our own. Their legacy is the landscape of our genome, and their ghosts walk beside us, a silent reminder that for most of history, we were not alone. And now, as our long journey through deep time comes to a close, allow the vastness of that story to become a comfort. The frantic pace of our modern world fades away when measured against the slow, patient rhythm of geological time. The story of our ancestors, of all the struggles and all the triumphs, has led to this quiet moment, here, now, as you prepare for rest. The immense silence of the past is not an emptiness, but a deep and steady foundation upon which your own life is built. So let the fading images of these lost worlds become the landscape of your dreams. Picture a Neanderthal family, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering light of a fire in a deep cave, sharing stories in a language we will never hear. Imagine the shadow of a tiny hobbit, vanishing silently into the lush, green foliage of a tropical island, a secret kept by time. Think of the ghosts of the Altai Mountains and the brave, small hominins of the rising star, all part of the great and complex tapestry of our own existence. Their story is now a part of yours, a deep and ancient lullaby, whispering that you are the result of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back millions of years. Let that thought hold you, and let the great silence of the past bring you a profound and peaceful sleep.